Good evening, listeners. Welcome to Noir Intellect. I'm your host, Victor Blackwood. If you enjoy mysteries, hidden clues, and uncovering the truth, don't forget to like and subscribe. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Leave it in the comments below. Now, keep your eyes open and your mind sharp. The mystery begins now. Chapter 1. The surgeon who closed his door at 8:43 on a wet Thursday evening. I was halfway through a plate of cold chicken and considering whether the chicken or the weather had suffered the greater injustice when the front doorbell rang. I knew it was trouble before I answered it. The reason was simple. Ordinary visitors rang once. Salesmen rang twice. Delivery men leaned on the bell as though electricity were a personal enemy. Clients with money and dignity rang once and waited. This visitor rang 3 times, each separated by precisely 5 seconds. I put down my fork. From the dining room came the faint scrape of a chair. Nero Wolfe had heard it too. "Mr. Goodwin," he called. "I know. Then why are you still there?" I was hoping the visitor would go away. Hope is a poor substitute for action. That has been said about detectives, not by anyone intelligent. I went to the front hall. The rain had darkened the stone steps outside. Through the frosted glass I could see a young woman standing beneath the porch light, holding something against her chest with both hands. She looked as if she had been running. I opened the door. "Yes? Is this Nero Wolfe's house?" "It is. I need to see him. You'll have to give me a reason." She glanced over her shoulder toward the street. Someone followed me. That changed things. I opened the door wider. "Come in." She entered quickly. She was perhaps 26, slim, pale, and dressed in a dark wool coat that had absorbed enough rain to make it shine. A strand of brown hair had escaped from beneath her hat. Her breathing was controlled but not calm. She held a black surgical case. It was old, very old. The leather had cracked along the corners. A brass clasp showed beneath years of tarnish. On its lid were 2 initials, impressed into the leather. A.B. I closed the door. Name? Eleanor Price. Occupation? She hesitated. Research assistant. Dr. Arthur Bell. That name explained the expression on her face. Arthur Bell was not merely a surgeon. He was one of those physicians whose names appeared in newspapers. Whenever the subject was an operation nobody else wished to attempt. He had performed delicate procedures on prominent New Yorkers, published enough medical papers to fill a shelf, and acquired a reputation for refusing patients unless he believed he could help them. He was also known for being extremely private. I had met him once at a charity dinner and remembered that he had shaken my hand as though testing whether I could survive an operation. "Your doctor, Bell's assistant." "Not exactly." "What happened to him?" She looked toward the door. "He's gone." "Where?" "I don't know." "How long?" "Since yesterday morning." "Has the police been notified?" "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because I don't think the police understand what happened." "And you think Mr. Wolfe will?" "I don't know." She looked at the surgical case. "I only know that Dr. Bell told me if anything happened to him I was to bring this here." "Why here?" "He gave me the address." "Personally?" "Yes." "When?" 2 days ago." "Under what circumstances?" She swallowed. "He was frightened." That was enough to make me forget the chicken. I took her coat. "Come in." We entered the office. Wolfe sat behind his desk with a book open before him. He was enormous, immaculately dressed, and entirely composed. The room smelled faintly of orchids, polished wood, and the dinner Fritz had prepared. On the far side of the office, a tall arrangement of white orchids stood beneath a lamp. Wolfe looked at the woman, then at the surgical case, then at me. "Who is she?" "Eleanor Price. She works for Dr. Arthur Bell." Wolfe's eyes returned to the case. "Put it on the desk." She obeyed. The case made a soft thud against the walnut. Wolfe did not touch it. "What has happened to Dr. Bell?" "He disappeared." "When?" "Yesterday morning." "Why did you wait until tonight?" "I didn't." "Explain." "I went to his apartment first, then his office, then I tried the hospital. Nobody knew where he was." "And the police?" "I was afraid to call them." "Why?" "Because he told me not to." Wolfe's eyebrows rose. He anticipated his disappearance. He said he might have to disappear. "Why?" "He didn't tell me." She looked at the case. "That if he stopped answering his door, if he cancelled his appointments, and if anyone asked me whether I knew where he was, I was to say nothing. Yet you have come here. He also told me that if I became frightened enough to believe he was in danger, I should bring this case to Nero Wolfe. Wolfe leaned back. Why did he know my name? I don't know. You were not instructed to tell me anything else. No. What is inside? I haven't opened it. Why? Because he told me not to. I glanced at Wolfe. He glanced at me. Mr. Goodwin, he said. I opened the case. Inside lay a folded cloth, a narrow glass vial, a pair of old surgical scissors, and 3 objects that immediately separated themselves from the rest. A yellowed photograph, a brass key, a scrap of paper. The paper contained 3 words. The 5th name. I looked at Wolfe. He had not moved. Interesting, he said. That was all. I lifted the photograph. It showed a group of 5 men standing outside what appeared to be a hospital or medical institute. The image was badly faded, but the faces remained visible. 5 men. 4 were middle-aged. The 5th was younger. On the back, someone had written a date, 31 years earlier. Below it were 5 handwritten names. The first 4 were legible. The 5th had been scratched out so violently that the paper was nearly torn. I turned the photograph over again. That seems to fit. Wolfe extended his hand. I passed it to him. He studied the faces. Do you recognize any? Eleanor answered quietly. Dr. Bell. She pointed to the youngest man. That's Tim. Wolfe examined the photograph longer. Who are the others? I know 2 names. Dr. Martin Hale and Dr. Samuel Reed. And the remaining 2? I've heard their names. Which are? Thomas Avery and Charles Merritt. Wolfe looked at the 5th erased name. Then this is not a photograph of 5 men. No, it is a photograph of 4 men and a secret. Eleanor stared at him. I decided not to mention that he had already started sounding pleased. Wolfe turned to the brass key. It was old-fashioned, long and narrow, with a small circular head. No number, no engraving. Where did Bell keep it? I don't know. Did you ever see it? No. Did he ever mention a key? No. The photograph? The words? No. Then why did he give you the case? Because he trusted me. She hesitated. Because I found something. What? An old patient file. Wolfe's attention sharpened. Continue. It was in a locked cabinet in Dr. Bell's office. Why did you open it? I was looking for another file. What did you find? A name. The 5th name. I don't know. What name? She looked at the floor. Peter Lang. Wolfe's fingers stopped moving. Who was Peter Lang? I don't know. You are certain? I'd never heard the name before. Why was it important? I don't know. Then why did you become frightened? Because the file had been removed. By whom? I don't know. Was the cabinet forced? No. Locked? Yes. Who had access? Bell. His office manager. Who? Mrs. Caroline Webb. Does she know where Bell is? No. Have you asked? She disappeared, too. I sat up. Mrs. Webb? She didn't come to work yesterday. Has anyone reported that? I don't know. Wolfe looked at me. Archie. Yes. Tomorrow morning. Begin with Mrs. Webb. All right. Tonight we have more immediate questions. He looked at Eleanor. When did Bell close his office? Monday afternoon. Not yesterday? No. His appointments were cancelled beginning Monday. Yes. How? Telephone. By Bell, apparently. Did anyone speak with him? The receptionist said he sounded normal. Normal? Calm. Then why did he tell you he might disappear? I don't know. Wolfe looked again at the photograph. How many people knew about this? About what? The photograph. No one. The key? No one. The phrase? No one. The file. She hesitated. I told one person. Who? Dr. Martin Hale. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Why? He was Bell's closest colleague. Was? They haven't spoken in years. Why? I don't know. Yet you told him. He saw me carrying the file. When? Last week. What did he say? He asked where I found it. And I told him. What did he do? He told me to forget the name Peter Lang. Did he explain? No. Was he frightened? She looked at Wolfe. Yes. Wolfe leaned back. Now we have the beginning of a pattern, I said. A pattern? Bell disappears. He lifted one finger. His assistant disappears. Another finger. An old patient file disappears. Another. 4 men appear in an old photograph. Another. A 5th name is erased. Another. And someone has preserved a key for more than 30 years. He looked at the scrap of paper. The question is not the 5th name means. I looked at the 3 words. What is it? Why someone was willing to erase it? Eleanor stayed another hour. Wolfe questioned her with the patience of a man examining a complicated mechanism. He learned that Dr. Bell lived alone in a townhouse on East 62nd Street. His surgical practice occupied the third floor of a medical building downtown. He had no known enemies, no known deaths, no recent illness. But 3 weeks earlier, he had become withdrawn. He began cancelling evening engagements. He stopped attending professional meetings. He spent several nights in his office. He ordered old files from storage. He asked Eleanor to locate medical records more than 20 years old. He also asked her whether she had ever heard of a place called the Halstead Clinic. She had not, neither had I. Wolfe wrote the name down. Did Bell say why he wanted the records? No. Did he mention the photograph? No. Did he mention the fifth name? No. Then why did he give you the case? She looked at the brass key. I think he knew he was being watched. Why? He told me that someone had entered his office. Anything stolen? How did he know? Things had been moved. What things? Books. That is not evidence of a crime. One book was upside down. I looked at Wolfe. He looked at me. Was it normally upright? Yes. How did Bell know? He was very particular. Like Mr. Wolfe? She almost smiled. Not quite. Nobody is. Wolfe ignored me. What else? He found a chair moved. Anything else? A drawer was open. Was anything missing? Not that he could tell. Did he call the police? No. Why? He said police were useful after a crime, not before one. Wolfe's expression changed slightly. Bell was sensible. I took out my notebook. Did he tell you what he was looking for? No. Did he ever mention the number 5? She hesitated. Once. When? What did he say? He asked me, if you found 5 names in an old file and one had been removed, would you assume the missing name mattered most? What did you answer? I said yes. What did he say? He said, that's what they want you to think. Wolfe's fingers stopped over the photograph. What did he mean? I don't know. Neither did I. But Wolfe did not look displeased. He looked interested. That was worse. At 11:30, Eleanor left the brownstone under instructions to stay at a hotel and tell nobody where she was. I walked her to the door. Before leaving, she turned. Miss Goodwin, yes. Do you think Dr. Bell is alive? I considered giving her the comforting answer. I don't. I never have. Yes. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Why? Because Wolfe hasn't started looking for a body. She gave me a nervous smile. Is that supposed to reassure me? It reassures me. She left. I locked the door. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was examining the key. What is it? I gathered that. Old brass. Also obvious. He looked at me. You are impatient. That is one of my better qualities. Only when directed I sat down. What do you think? The key opens something. That is generally what keys do, not always. What else could it do? Prove possession. I looked at the photograph. The fifth name, yes. Peter Lang, perhaps. You don't believe it. I believe the name exists. That's not the same thing. No. He picked up the photograph. Notice the arrangement. The 5 men stood in a line. Bell was at the center. Martin Hale stood to his left. Samuel Reed to his right. Thomas Avery and Charles Merritt stood at the ends. Bell was the youngest. Yes, yet he stands in the center. Maybe because it was his photograph. No, Wolfe pointed to the ground. Look at their shadows. I leaned closer. The photograph was faded, but the angle of light remained visible. Afternoon sun. Yes, the men are standing outside. Correct. Why does that matter? The building behind them. I examined it. The sign above the entrance had nearly disappeared, but enough remained. Halstead. Yes, the Halstead Clinic. I sat back. So the 5 names are connected to the clinic. Almost certainly. And Bell worked there 31 years ago. Peter Lang too? That is what we must determine. And the key? Perhaps it belongs to the clinic. The clinic still exists? No, then where? Wolfe handed me the photograph. The answer is probably in the records. The next morning began with a visit to the hospital where Bell had practiced. Dr. Martin Hale was not there. He had retired. I found his address and drove across town. His apartment was on the 8th floor of an old building overlooking the river. A woman answered the door. Mr. Hale is resting. Archie Goodwin. She looked at my card. From Nero Wolfe? Yes. She hesitated, then opened the door. Hale sat near the window wearing a dark robe. He was perhaps 65, thin, grey-haired and sharp-eyed. His first words were not a greeting. Where is Eleanor? Safe? Did she come to you last night? He closed his eyes. I told Bell she would be in danger. Who? Anyone who touched those records. What records? He looked at me. You know about the 5th name, yes. His face changed. Then we're already too late. Too late for what? For Bell. Is he dead? I don't know. You seem to think so. I know what happened 31 years ago. Tell me. He shook his head. No. Why? Because I signed something. The contract? No. Then what? He looked toward the river. A statement. About what? The death of Peter Lang. The room seemed to grow colder. Peter Lang is dead? Yes. How? During surgery? Bell nodded. 31 years ago. Was it malpractice? No. Then why hide his name? Because he did not die. I stared at him. You just said he died. He was declared dead. That's different. Very. Who made the declaration? Hale looked at me. Arthur Bell. I felt a chill. Then, where did Peter Lang go? Hale's voice dropped. That is what the fifth name means. What happened to the body? There wasn't one. I stared at him. He continued. There was never a body. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the orchid room. I told him everything. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said only, "Good. We have our first dead man who may be alive." I knew you'd appreciate that. He looked at me. Mr. Goodwin. Yes? The case has changed. How? We are no longer looking for Dr. Bell. Then what are we looking for? The fifth name. I glanced toward the office. The yellowed photograph lay beneath the brass key. For 31 years, someone had tried to erase one name. Now that name had begun to return. And somewhere in New York, a surgeon who had closed his door had left us 3 words because he knew that once the fifth name was spoken, someone would have to explain why a man officially dead had never possessed a body. Wolfe turned toward his orchids. Arrange for Kramer. Tonight? Immediately. Why? Because if Peter Lang is alive, Mr. Goodwin, he is not the only person who knows it. And that was when I understood that Dr. Arthur Bell had not disappeared to escape a danger. He had disappeared because the danger had finally found him. Chapter 2. The photograph with 5 men. The next morning began with a complication. I like complications when they arrive after breakfast. Before breakfast, they have a tendency to spoil the eggs. Wolfe had finished his coffee and was reading a medical journal when I entered the office with 3 folders under my arm. You're late, he said. I've been following a photograph. Photographs do not require pursuit. This one does. I put the folders on his desk. He looked at them without enthusiasm. The original photograph? Tracked it. Where? To a medical charity dinner held 20 years ago. Wolfe's eyes moved to mine. 20? That's what makes it interesting. The photograph in Bell's surgical case is older. Yes. So, I think we have 2 versions of the same photograph. That got his attention. He put down the journal. Explain. The photograph Bell gave Eleanor appears to have been printed from an older negative. The archive has another print from a charity dinner 20 years ago. Same setting. Same 4 physicians. Same empty chair. Wolfe held out his hand. I gave him the archival photograph. He studied it. The scene showed a long banquet table, behind which stood 4 men in formal evening clothes. Arthur Bell was the youngest. Beside him stood 3 other physicians. At the far end of the group was an empty chair, a 5th position. A deliberate gap. On the back was printed, Metropolitan Medical Relief Association, dinner. 20 years ago. Wolfe turned it over. Who identified Bell? Eleanor. She recognizes the others? No. Names? 3 are identified in the archive. I pointed. Dr. Martin Hale, Dr. Samuel Reed, Thomas Avery. And the chair? That's the interesting part. Whose? Nobody knows. Wolfe looked at the empty chair. Somebody knew. That's what I thought. You are improving. Don't spread it around. He returned to the photograph. Where is Charles Merritt? I paused. Who? Charles Merritt. The name from the earlier photograph. I stared at him. You remember. I remember everything you tell me. That's inconvenient. Only for you. I pulled another photograph from the folder. It showed the same 4 men. The angle was slightly different. Bell, Hale, Reed, Avery, and again the empty chair. No Charles Merritt. No 5th physician, I said. Yet you found the name in Bell's earlier records. Yes. Where? In the hospital archive. And his personnel file ends abruptly. Wolfe nodded. Good. That's your second good in 2 days. Do not become accustomed to it. I sat down. There's something else. There usually is. The photograph was taken 20 years ago. Yes. The surgical case is 31 years old. Yes. Which means Bell preserved the older material for 11 years before the charity dinner. Correct? Why? Wolfe studied the empty chair. Perhaps because the chair was more important than the men. I leaned forward. Doing what? Making furniture suspicious. It has a chair. It is an empty chair. Exactly. The Metropolitan Medical Relief Association occupied 3 floors of a limestone building near Park Avenue. The dinner photograph had been catalogued in an archive devoted to the association's history. The archivist was a small, brisk woman named Helen Marsh, who wore spectacles on a chain and regarded researchers as people who had failed to make proper use of indexes. "I have the original event program," she told me. "That would help." "It won't answer your question." "Which question?" "Who sat in the empty chair?" "Why not?" "Because the program lists 5 speakers." She placed the document before me. 5 names: Arthur Bell, Martin Hale, Samuel Reed, Thomas Arry, and the 5th, Dr. Peter Lang. I stared. The name seemed to sharpen on the page. Peter Lang. The same name Eleanor had found in Bell's old patient file. The same name Hale had claimed belonged to a man who had been declared dead. I looked at Helen. "When was this program printed?" 3 days before the dinner. Was Lang expected to attend, according to the program? Did he? I don't know. Why is there an empty chair? Nobody has documented it. Was he alive, according to our records, at the time of the dinner? She hesitated. Yes. Then why did he not sit there? I told you. What? No one documented it. I smiled. That may be the most useful answer I've heard today. She frowned. How? Because somebody documented everything else. I spent the next 2 hours in the archive. The Medical Association had kept meticulous records. Receipts, programs, photographs, membership lists, awards, minutes, correspondence. The more I read, the stranger the absence became. Peter Lang appeared everywhere. He had been a respected surgeon. He had worked at Halstead Clinic. He had published articles with Bell. He had received professional honors. He had attended charity functions. Then, suddenly nothing. No obituary, no retirement, no resignation, no memorial, no explanation. His name simply stopped appearing. The last documented reference placed him at Halstead Clinic 31 years earlier, exactly where Bell's story began. I returned to the photograph. The empty chair occupied the 5th position, not casually. Its placement was precise. The 4 men stood at carefully measured intervals. Bell, Hale, Reed, Avery. Then the chair. There was enough room beside the chair for another person. No one stood there. Nobody had moved it aside. It had been placed as part of the arrangement. I remembered Wolfe's earlier remark. The 5th position. Not necessarily the 5th man. The 5th place. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the dining room. Lunch was roast chicken with asparagus and a salad whose ingredients I could identify only because Fritz had once explained them to me at length. Wolfe listened while I talked. When I reached Peter Lang's name, he stopped cutting his chicken. Repeat, Peter Lang. Again, Peter Lang. He set down his knife. The 5th name. Exactly. And the 5th position? An empty chair. Good. That makes 3. You count too much. Occupational hazard. He wiped his fingers. Now tell me the important part. The chair was deliberately positioned. Yes. The program lists Lang. Yes. His name disappeared from hospital history. Yet 20 years ago he was still listed in the charity program. Wolfe nodded. That discrepancy matters. Why? Because people can erase a name from a hospital history, not from every record. Correct. And if they tried, they would create contradictions. Which is what we have. Precisely, he returned to his meal. I said, Eleanor insists she has never seen the other men. She should not have. Why? Because she is not remembering faces. What is she remembering? Names. From her father's papers. Exactly. That bothered me. How would her father know Peter Lang? Wolfe looked at me. That is the question you will ask her. Eleanor arrived at 4. She had changed clothes, but still looked as though sleep had been an item removed from her schedule. I showed her the charity photograph. She immediately pointed to Bell. That's him. And these? She shook her head. No, you're certain. I've seen their names. Where? My father's papers. Which papers? He kept medical correspondence about Bell, about Halstead Clinic. I placed the program before her. Peter Lang, she stared. That name. You recognize it. My father wrote it. What did he say? I don't remember. Try. She closed her eyes. My father kept a notebook. Where? At home. Can you get it? She nodded. Bring it. Her gaze returned to the photograph. Why is there an empty chair? That's what we're trying to find out. She looked frightened. Dr. Bell once told me never ask about Peter Lang. Why? He said some names are dangerous. I smiled. Names aren't dangerous. She looked at me. The people attached to them can be. She returned 40 minutes later with a small leather notebook. The cover had softened with age. Several pages contained medical abbreviations. Others listed patient names. Bell appeared repeatedly. So did Hale, Reed, Avery. Then, halfway through the notebook, the writing changed. The handwriting became larger and more hurried. One sentence occupied an entire page. The fifth name must never be removed from the record. I looked at Eleanor. Your father wrote this? Yes. Do you know why? No. Next page. There was only one line. If Lang disappears, ask who benefits. I felt the hair rise along my neck. Your father knew, she whispered. Knew what? That Lang would disappear. At 5:30 I telephoned Wolfe. He answered on the second ring. Yes, we have another piece. Bring it. When I arrived, he read the notebook page without speaking. Then he looked at the photograph. The fifth name. Lang. Yes. The fifth position. The chair. Yes. The hospital removed Lang's name. Yes. But his name remained in private records. Yes. Wolfe leaned back. Then we have established the central fact. What fact? Peter Lang was not forgotten. I frowned. His name was deliberately suppressed. Exactly. Which means somebody wanted us to believe he had vanished. Yet. Why preserve the photograph? Because someone wanted a future investigator to notice the absence. I stared at him. Bell, possibly. Then Bell may have created the trail, or inherited it. The photograph, the key, the phrase, the missing name. Wolfe nodded. 4 pieces. What is the fifth? He looked toward the empty chair in the photograph. The chair itself. I laughed. You're still suspicious of furniture. I am suspicious of what people place deliberately. That evening I returned to the archive alone. There was one final record I had not examined. The hospital's annual history. 31 years earlier, the edition contained a chapter titled Distinguished Surgical Staff. Bell, Hale, Reed, Avery, no Lang. I checked the previous edition. Bell, Hale, Reed, Avery, Lang. 5 names. The difference was unmistakable. Someone had removed Lang between editions. Not omitted him accidentally. Removed him. I photographed both pages. Then I noticed something written in pencil along the margin of the older edition. A number. 5, nothing else. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I remembered the scrap from Bell's surgical case. The fifth name. The words were no longer mysterious. They were an instruction. Find the fifth name. But why? And why had Bell made certain that Archie Goodwin would be the one to find it? At 9 that night, Wolfe was in his orchid room. The plants stood in ordered ranks beneath their lamps. He had one of the old hospital histories open on a small table beside him. Lang was erased 20 years ago. Yes, yet the charity program from the same period preserves his name. Yes, the photograph preserves his place, even though the chair is empty. The empty chair is evidence of what? That someone expected Lang to attend, but he didn't. Correct. Because he was already officially dead. Wolfe looked at me. Not necessarily. I remembered Hale's statement. He had said Lang was declared dead 31 years ago. Yet the charity program 20 years ago expected him to attend. That meant one of 2 things. Either the program was a lie, or Peter Lang had survived his own death. I said as much. Wolfe nodded. Now you understand. And the 4 doctors? They were standing in a precise order. Why? Because the order of what? Names. I looked at the photograph again. Bell, Hale, Reed, Avery, the empty chair. 5 positions, 5 names. But the 5th name had been erased from one history and preserved in another. Wolfe turned away from the orchids. Mr. Goodwin, yes? Find out who occupied that chair before it became empty. You think someone sat there? Of course. Then why isn't he in the photograph? Because the photograph was taken after he left. I stared at him. How do you know? Wolfe's expression became almost amused. Because the chair is turned. I looked again. He was right. The empty chair was not aligned with the others. It had been pulled slightly backward, as though someone had risen from it only moments before. I felt a small cold certainty settle over me. The photograph had not captured an empty seat. It had captured an absence. And, somewhere between the evening, when Peter Lang disappeared from the official record, and the charity dinner 20 years later. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure that the fifth name remained visible only to those who knew where to look. Wolfe returned to his orchids. I stood there with the photograph in my hand. The surgeon who had closed his door had left us a trail, but it was no longer leading toward his disappearance. It was leading backward. 31 years, 5 empty chairs, and a name that someone had tried very hard to kill a second time. Chapter 3. The patient who was never listed. There are two kinds of medical records. The first kind is written by doctors who expect somebody to read it. The second kind is written by doctors who know somebody will. The distinction had become important by the time I returned to Wolfe's office the following morning, with a copy of the Halstead Clinic register under my arm. Wolfe was in the orchid room. That meant he was either thinking or avoiding me. With Wolfe, the distinction was usually academic. I found him examining a white orchid, whose petals had developed a faint brown mark. He did not look up. "Well, I have found your patient. The fifth name? No. The missing surgeon? No. The man who moved the chair? Not yet." He frowned. "Then why are you smiling?" "Because I have found a patient who officially never existed." That got him away from the orchid. "Explain." I handed him the register. 20 years ago at Halstead Clinic, an unidentified patient was admitted under emergency circumstances. Name? Nah. Age? Approximately 40. Sex? Male. Condition? Severe abdominal trauma according to the official record. None. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Why? Because the register says he died before surgery. Yet? I handed him another sheet. Bell's private notes say the operation was completed successfully. He looked at the page. For several seconds there was no sound except the faint hum of the heating system. Then Wolfe said, "Who supplied this?" "An old records clerk." "Name?" "George Larkin. Reliable. He worked at Halstead for 40 years. "Good. There's more." "There generally is." "The patient was transferred out after surgery?" "Yes." "Where that's the problem?" Explain." "He was transferred under another name." Wolfe looked at me. "Which name?" "Daniel Price." He lowered the paper. "Interesting." That was my reaction. No. What? Interesting would be if Daniel Price existed. He did. Where? That's where the trail ends. Wolfe looked again at the documents. No. The trail does not end. It does on paper. Paper is frequently dishonest. That's why I brought it to you. He gave the faintest nod. Continue. The trail had begun 31 years earlier at Halstead Clinic. The building itself no longer existed. It had been demolished 12 years ago and replaced by a glass medical center, whose lobby contained no memorial plaque, no photograph, and no suggestion that one of Manhattan's most respected surgical institutions had once occupied the same ground. Halstead had been known for emergency medicine and experimental surgery. It had also been known for secrecy. That was not an accusation, it was a fact. Patients came through emergency entrances at all hours. Doctors worked long shifts. Names were sometimes incomplete. Families sometimes arrived later. Records were occasionally corrected. But the patient in question presented a difficulty no clerk could explain away. His admission existed. His surgery existed. His transfer existed. His death existed. Only the patient did not. The official register showed the following. Male, approximately 40 years. Admitted 11:47 p.m. Severe abdominal trauma. Expired 12:18 a.m. No operative intervention. That would have been unremarkable if Bell's private notes had not survived. His handwriting was unmistakable. I had compared it with several authenticated samples. Sharp, compact, impatient. A surgeon's handwriting with no patience for decorative letters. The private note contained only a few lines. Patient stabilized. Emergency procedure completed at 1:35 a.m. Prognosis favorable. Then, transfer ordered under protected identity. And beneath that, do not enter name in general register. I had read the sentence 3 times. It remained there. No ambiguity, no uncertainty. Bell had deliberately ordered the patient's identity concealed. The official record had then declared the patient dead, which meant that somewhere between midnight and dawn, one person had been alive in an operating room while the hospital's records said he was dead. Wolfe sat behind his desk while I continued. Why would Bell hide a patient's name? That is what we're going to discover. Could it have been a witness protection matter? Possibly. A criminal? Possibly. A government official? Possibly. A wealthy patient? Possibly. You're very generous with possibilities. I am preserving them until facts remove them. I took out another folder. There's something else. Yes, the operation wasn't ordinary. How? Bell used a procedure that wasn't yet standard. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. At that time, yes. What procedure? An experimental vascular repair. Risky, extremely, and successful. According to Bell, what happened afterward? The patient was transferred. Where? Agnes Recovery Home. That institution still exists? No, another disappearance. Closed 26 years ago. Records? Destroyed. Convenient. Very. He leaned back. Who authorized the transfer? Bell. Who witnessed it? 2 nurses. Names? One is dead. The other? Where? Queens. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Go. I was already standing. Her name was Margaret Sloane. She was 81, lived in a narrow brick house with a garden carefully maintained despite her age, and answered the door with the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to be intimidated. When I introduced myself, she said, "I know who you work for. That saves time." It doesn't. She let me inside. The living room smelled of tea, furniture polish, and old books. Photographs covered the walls. Children, weddings, graduations, a life properly documented. I explained why I had come. She listened without interrupting. When I mentioned Halstead Clinic, her expression changed. Not fear, recognition. "You've been looking for the man." I stopped. "What man?" "The one who wasn't supposed to exist." I sat down. "How much do you know?" "Enough." "Did you nurse him?" "Yes." "Was he alive?" She gave me a sharp look. I watched him breathe. "Bell operated?" "Yes." "Successfully?" "Yes." "Then why did the hospital register say he died?" "Because someone wanted him dead on paper." "Who?" "I never knew." "Did Bell?" "Yes." "Are you certain?" "I was standing beside him." "What did he say?" "He told me the man's name must never appear." "Why?" "Because the man's life depended on it." "What was his name?" Hesitated, then said, "Peter Lang." The room seemed suddenly smaller. "You knew? Did you know who he was?" "No." "Why was he protected?" "Bell never told me." "Where was he transferred?" "St. Agnes." "Under what name?" She looked directly at me. "Daniel Price." I felt the first real click of the mechanism. "Why did you remember that?" "Because I wrote it." "On the transfer order?" "Yes." "Do you still have it?" "No." "Are you certain?" "I kept a copy." "Where?" She pointed toward a cabinet. "Top drawer." Inside was a collection of old papers tied with ribbon. She found the transfer sheet after several minutes. The paper had browned, the ink had faded, but the name remained, Daniel Price. Below it, transferred in stable condition, then private arrangement, and beneath that, Bell's signature. I looked up. "Why did you keep this?" She gave a tired smile. "Because Bell told me to." When I returned to Wolfe, he was in the dining room. Lunch was delayed. That meant the case had acquired sufficient importance to interfere with one of Wolfe's sacred schedules. I handed him the transfer order. He read it. Then he read it again. "Peter Lang." "Yes." "Transferred as Daniel Price." "Yes." 20 years ago." "Yes." "After Bell performed emergency surgery." "Yes." "Patient then disappeared." "Not disappeared." "What?" "Changed identity." Wolfe nodded. "Exactly." He placed the document on the table. "Now we must ask why." "I've been asking." "Not sufficiently." "What do you want?" "The identity of Daniel Price. The records are gone." "Some are." "The recovery home closed." "Yes." "The records were supposedly destroyed." "Supposedly." "You think someone kept them?" "I know someone did." "Who?" "The person who knew the patient's identity was worth protecting." I stared at him. "Bell." "Possibly." "Peter Lang?" "Possibly." "Someone else?" "Almost certainly." He reached for the telephone. "Call Kramer." "Why?" "Because we have established something important." "What?" The 5th name was not merely removed. It was protected. Inspector Kramer arrived 40 minutes later. He examined the transfer order, then the hospital register, then Bell's private notes. His expression became increasingly sour. "You're telling me this patient was alive after the hospital recorded him dead?" "Yes." "Bell performed the operations?" "Yes." "Then transferred him under another name?" "Correct." "Why?" Wolfe answered. "Because somebody wanted Peter Lang to disappear." Kramer looked at me. "Who was Peter Lang?" The fifth name. The inspector stared at the photograph. 5 positions, 4 men, 1 empty chair. Lang was one of these? Yes. And he was supposedly dead. Yes, but 20 years ago his name appeared in a charity program. Yes. Kramer looked irritated. I hate old cases. They are often more obedient. Explain, dead records do not change. Kramer gave Wolfe a hard look. You're enjoying this. I am tolerating it. Same thing with you. Wolfe ignored him. Inspector, what do you know about Arthur Bell's disappearance? Not much. When did he last appear? Monday afternoon. Where? His office. Who saw him? Several patients. 1. Name? Kramer checked his notebook. Unknown. Description male. Grey coat. No identification. When? About 4 in the afternoon. Did he speak to Bell? How do you know? The receptionist heard raised voices. About what? She couldn't hear Wolfe's. Eyes sharpened. Did the visitor leave? Yes. Bell? 2 hours later. Together? No. Then? Bell locked his office and disappeared. Correct. Wolfe folded his hands. Who else knew Bell was investigating Peter Lang? Kramer looked at him. I don't know. Find out. The inspector sighed. You've got a habit of giving orders. You've got a habit of needing them. Kramer stood. I'll see what I can find. At the door he stopped. One thing. Yes? The young woman who came here. Eleanor? Yes, why? Kramer looked at me. Someone searched her apartment this morning. I felt my stomach tighten. What was taken? Nothing. Wolfe's expression changed. Again, Kramer nodded. Nothing. Then someone was looking. At what? Memory. After Kramer left, Wolfe remained silent. I said, they're searching for the same thing. Yes. The fifth name, perhaps. The patient, perhaps. The contract, perhaps. Do you have another answer? I have a question. What? Why was Peter Lang protected? I thought about the evidence. A surgeon operated on him. The hospital declared him dead. A nurse transferred him under a false name. A charity program 20 years later still listed him. His name vanished from the hospital's history. Bell disappeared after reopening the old records. Someone searched Eleanor's apartment. The brass key remained unexplained, and on a faded photograph, 4 physicians stood beside an empty chair. The 5th position had been preserved. The 5th name had been erased. I said, maybe Lang knew something. Wolfe nodded. That is the obvious answer. What if it's wrong? Then we find the less obvious one. He rose. The discussion was evidently finished. I followed him toward the stairs. At the bottom he stopped. Mr. Goodwin, yes? Tomorrow, find Daniel Price. The false identity. Yes, if he was Peter Lang, he was. I am. Then where do I look? Wolfe looked toward the front door. Start with the person who benefited from his disappearance. The 5th name? No, he paused. The other 4. That night I studied the photograph again. Bell, Hale, Reed, Avery, the empty chair. The more I looked, the less it resembled a charity dinner. It looked like an arrangement. 5 places, 4 men, 1 absence. And perhaps the most important thing was not who had disappeared. It was who remained. Arthur Bell had closed his door. Peter Lang had been erased. Someone had protected him for 20 years. Someone else had spent 20 years trying to make sure he stayed invisible. And now, suddenly, Bell had broken the silence. The surgical case had been delivered. The 5th name had been written. The key had survived. The photograph had returned. A patient who was never listed had become the center of a mystery that had outlived the hospital that created it. I put out my cigarette and turned toward the stairs. Wolfe's light was still visible beneath the door of his bedroom. He was not sleeping, neither was I, because one fact had become impossible to ignore. If Peter Lang had survived his official death, then someone had spent 20 years protecting a living man from discovery. And if Arthur Bell had finally decided to expose the truth, the question was no longer why he disappeared. The question was who had become frightened when he began to speak. Chapter 4. The 5th name. The trouble with old hospitals is that they never entirely disappear. They may be demolished, their bricks hauled away, their corridors replaced by offices with glass walls and tasteful furniture, their names forgotten by people who were born after the wrecking crews arrived. But a hospital is not merely a building. It is a collection of records, habits, grudges, mistakes, triumphs, and secrets that tend to outlive the walls. The Halstead Clinic had been gone for 12 years. Its replacement was a modern medical center with an underground garage, polished elevators, and a lobby containing an arrangement of orchids that would have offended Wolfe on botanical grounds. I knew because I had taken a photograph of them. Wolfe had examined it the previous evening and said, "Those are not properly maintained." I had told him that the photograph was not the important part. He had replied, "Everything has an important part." That morning he proved the point. I arrived in the office at 9:20 with the brass key from Arthur Bell's surgical case in my pocket. Wolfe was seated behind his desk. The key lay on the blotter. I had put it there before leaving. He had apparently been staring at it for several minutes. "You're looking at that as if it owes you money," I said. "It owes me an answer. Did it confess?" "Not yet." "You've been patient." "I have been forced to be." I took the chair opposite him. "The old Halstead Records room is still beneath the present medical center." "Yes." "How do you know?" "Daniel Morris confirmed it. He said the basement was sealed." "Partially." "Then why haven't we searched it?" Wolfe looked at me. "Because you have not yet obtained permission." "I have it." "From whom?" "The hospital administrator." "Good. Also from the city." "Better." "And Inspector Kramer." "Necessary." I reached into my coat. "Then I suppose this belongs to you." I placed the brass key on his desk. Wolfe examined it again. "Where did Bell obtain it?" "Unknown." "What does it open?" "Unknown." "Excellent." I smiled. "You have a peculiar definition of excellent. It leaves possibilities." "And what are we doing?" "Removing them." The entrance to the old records level was behind a service corridor in the basement of the modern medical center. Daniel Morris met me there shortly after 10. He carried a ring of keys, a flashlight, and the expression of a man who had spent his career discovering that buildings were much more complicated than architects admitted. This was part of Halstead? Yes. What survived? Foundations, 2 underground storage areas, some old utility passages, and the records room underneath the present archive. Why was it never demolished? Nobody considered it worth the cost. That's reassuring. Is it? No. He unlocked a steel door. Beyond it lay darkness. The air smelled of concrete, dust, and something faintly metallic. We descended 12 steps. The modern hospital disappeared above us. The old Halstead returned. Brick walls, low ceilings, iron pipes, faded directional signs, a painted arrow pointing toward Recrus. I followed it. The corridor ended at a heavy wooden door. Daniel stopped. "This is as far as I've been." "Why?" "The old room is sealed." "How?" "Steel cabinet wall." I looked at him. Cabinet wall. Record storage. "Then we're in luck." He frowned. "Why?" "Because I have a key." I took the brass key from my pocket. The lock looked almost too ordinary. I inserted it. It turned smoothly. Daniel stared. "You've got to be kidding." "I wish I were." The door opened inward. Behind it was a narrow passage. At the far end stood row after row of metal storage cabinets. Most were rusted. Some had collapsed. Others remained intact. Dust lay thick across every surface. No footprints, no recent disturbance. At first glance the room appeared untouched. At second glance it didn't. One cabinet stood slightly open. Its handle showed a clean patch beneath the dust. Someone had opened it recently. I pointed. Daniel swore softly. I walked toward it. The cabinet contained old patient files. Boxes, ledgers, transfer documents, all labeled by year. The date on the nearest box was 31 years old. I pulled it free. The lid had been disturbed. Inside were files from the final years of Halstead Clinic. Bell's name appeared repeatedly. So did Hale, Reed, Avery, and occasionally Peter Lang, the 5th name. I looked toward Daniel. "We found the right room." He nodded. "Maybe, no." I touched the inside of the cabinet. "There is a reason Bell gave Eleanor the key." "What reason?" "Because he knew this room still existed. The records required hours to examine properly. There were hundreds of files. Most were irrelevant. Some concerned patients, others concerned billing. Still others contained surgical notes, equipment orders, staff schedules, and insurance correspondence. Then I found the cabinet. It stood in a recessed corner behind a collapsed shelf. Small, dark green, heavy brass lock. Unlike the other storage cabinets, it had no hospital inventory number. I called Daniel. "This one." He examined it. "Possibly. No label." "Exactly." I inserted Bell's key. It turned. The lock clicked. Inside lay 5 envelopes, nothing else. 5. Each was thick and yellowed. Each bore a name. Arthur Bell, Martin Howell, Samuel Reed, Thomas Avery, and the 5th, Peter Lang. I stood perfectly still. Daniel looked over my shoulder. That's the name. Yes, the dead man. Apparently. I lifted the first envelope. It contained routine correspondence, hospital schedules, a letter concerning a medical conference, a thank you note from an old patient, nothing. The second, Martin Hale, similar, clinical notes, a professional dispute, nothing criminal. The third, Samuel Reed, more correspondence, a payment request, a conference invitation, nothing. The fourth, Thomas Avery, routine, boring, almost aggressively innocent. Then the 5th, Peter Lang. The envelope felt different, heavier. I opened it. Inside lay a narrow financial ledger, small enough to fit inside a coat pocket. Its pages were covered with handwritten entries, dates, amounts, initials, account numbers. I turned the first few pages. Most were ordinary expenses, hospital supplies, medical equipment, staff payments. Then I reached the final section. The entries had been made on one night, 31 years earlier, the night of the unidentified operation. The amounts were substantial, and the recipients were not hospital departments. They were individuals. I read the first line, a payment to a private security company, another to a transportation service, another to an unnamed physician, another to a bank account. Then one final entry, a large sum. Beside it were 3 initials, A.B. Arthur Bell. I photographed every page. Then I found something worse, a second column. The payments were followed by brief notes. Transfer completed. Identity suppressed. Register altered. Statement prepared. And finally, Lang informed. I stopped. Daniel read over my shoulder. What's that mean? I don't know. But I knew enough. Peter Lang had not merely disappeared. He had known. We returned to the brownstone after 4. Wolfe was in the office. Fritz had just served lunch. Roast beef, potatoes, asparagus. Wolfe looked at the ledger, but did not touch it. Where was it? Below the old records room. Locked? Yes. With Bell's key? Yes. 5 envelopes? Exactly. 4 harmless, routine correspondence. The 5th? The ledger. I handed it to him. He read the entries. He did not speak for several minutes. When he reached the final page, his face became very still. Who was paid? Security. Transportation. Yes, a physician. Someone at a bank. Yes. Bell. Yes. Why? To move the patient. Wolfe shook his head. That is part of it. What else? To erase the patient. I sat down. Peter Lang knew. Yes, he knew what happened. Yes, and he was paid. No, I frowned. The ledger says. Look at the notation. I bent over the page. Lang informed. Not paid. Correct. So he was told. Yes. About what? That is the question. Wolfe turned the page back. Observe the sequence. Security. Transportation. Physician. Bank register alteration. Identity suppression. Then Lang informed. He tapped the paper. These are not random payments. No, they form a process of hiding the patient. Exactly. And Lang was told, because he knew enough to object. I stared at the 5th envelope. So he wasn't the patient? Wolfe's eyes rose to mine. Not necessarily. I felt the old frustration returning. Then what was Peter Lang? The 5th name. That's not an answer. It is the beginning of one. Inspector Kramer arrived shortly after 5. I gave him the ledger. He read it standing. By the time he finished, his face had acquired the expression he reserved for paperwork that might eventually become evidence. Where did this come from? Halstead. The old records room? Yes. Who knew it was there? Bell. Anyone else? Possibly the people who searched Eleanor's apartment. Kramer looked at Wolfe. You think Bell knew about this? Obviously, he had the key, yes. Then why didn't he take the ledger? He did. Kramer looked confused. Then why did you find it? Because he returned it. Why? To leave a trail. Kramer considered that. You think Bell wanted someone to find it, yes. Then why disappear? Because he wanted the right person to find it. Kramer glanced at me. That sentence sounded better before I thought about it. It often does. Wolfe ignored us. The ledger tells us that a patient was deliberately concealed. Peter Lang? No, Kramer frowned. Then who? We do not know. Yet, correct. The inspector rubbed his jaw. Then what does Lang know? Wolfe looked at the photograph lying beside the ledger. He knew enough to have his name removed. Kramer studied the 5 positions. Bell, Hale, Reed, Avery. Empty chair. Lang was supposed to be here. Yes, but he wasn't. No. Why? Because he had already disappeared. Kramer looked toward Wolfe. 31 years ago? Yes. Then why was his name still being used 20 years later? Wolfe's eyes sharpened. Exactly. That evening I returned to the old clinic records room with a flashlight. There was one detail bothering me. The 5 envelopes, 4 physicians, 1 missing man. Why preserve ordinary correspondence from 4 people if the ledger was the real evidence? Unless the envelopes themselves were part of the design. I examined them again. Each bore a name in the same handwriting, but the handwriting wasn't Bell's. I compared the letters with Bell's notes. Different. I compared them with the ledger. Different. I photographed the envelopes. Then I noticed a faint number beneath each name. Bell, 1 Hale, 2 Reed, 3 Avery, 4 Lang, 5. I stared at the number beneath Peter Lang's name. The phrase on Bell's scrap returned. The 5th name, not merely a name, a position, a sequence, a role. The 5th envelope was not simply evidence concerning Lang. It was the conclusion of a list. I turned the envelope over. There was another mark, almost invisible, a small red circle. The same mark appeared on the ledger's final page. I photographed it. Then I noticed something even stranger. The red mark also appeared beside one line in Bell's private surgical notes. The line read, "Patient transferred under protected identity." I stood there for a long moment. The case was becoming clearer. The patient had been hidden, but Peter Lang had been hidden too. 2 identities, 1 operation, 1 night, 5 doctors, and a ledger showing that money had changed hands to ensure that the official record told a different story. At 10 that night, I placed the photographs before Wolfe. He studied the numbers. The envelopes were arranged deliberately. Yes, 1 through 5. Yes. The 5th name, Peter Lang. Exactly. The question is why? Wolfe leaned back. He was not merely a witness. What was he? The person who could contradict the official story because he knew the patient survived. More than that. I waited. Wolfe continued. Suppose you wish to conceal an operation. You falsify the register. Yes. You create a death. Yes. You transfer the patient under another identity. Yes. You pay people to assist. Yes. But one physician knows the truth. Peter Lang. Exactly. So you remove his name from the history, from the hospital records, from professional records, until eventually he appears to have vanished. Wolfe nodded. But there is a flaw. What? If Lang knew the truth, he could still speak, unless he disappeared or was forced to disappear. Wolfe's expression hardened. Now you understand the danger. I looked at the photograph. 4 men, 1 empty chair, the 4 physicians, all involved, possibly Bell included. Yes. But Bell changed his mind at some point. He preserved the evidence. Yes. He gave Eleanor the key. Yes. He wanted us to find the 5th name. Yes. And Peter Lang. Wolfe looked at the ledger. Peter Lang may be the only man who knows why the patient had to disappear. Do you know who the patient was? No, not yet. He closed the ledger. But we now know something more important. What? Someone spent 31 years protecting the patient's identity. I looked at him. Why would they still care after all this time? Wolfe's answer was immediate. Because the patient is alive. I felt a chill. You think so? I think the evidence strongly suggests it. And if he is? Then someone has spent 31 years making sure nobody knows his name. I glanced at the brass key, the yellowed photograph, the 5 envelopes, the ledger, the empty chair. Suddenly the mystery seemed less like a search for a missing surgeon and more like a carefully buried machine. Every part had been designed, every name placed, every record altered, every payment made, every silence purchased. And at the center of it all was a patient whose name had never been entered into the register, a patient who had survived, a physician who knew it, and a 5th name that someone had tried to erase because it led directly to the truth. Wolfe reached for the telephone. Mr. Goodwin. Yes? Tomorrow we find Daniel Price, the patient. Yes. And Peter Lang? Wolfe's expression became thoughtful. We shall find him too. You think he's alive. I think the people who erased his name were too careful. Careful enough to kill him, possibly. Then why preserve his envelope? Wolfe looked at the 5th envelope. Because the dead do not require protection. I stared at him. Then Lang is alive. That is my conclusion. And Bell knew where he was. Almost certainly. Which means Bell's disappearance may have occurred because someone discovered that Bell had begun looking for him. The room went quiet. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows. The orchids upstairs remained under their lamps, untouched by the weather, and indifferent to human conspiracies. I thought of Dr. Arthur Bell closing his office door. I thought of Eleanor carrying the surgical case through the rain. I thought of the empty chair, the unidentified patient, the false death, the false name, the 5 envelopes, and the ledger that had waited 31 years beneath a hospital that no longer existed. The 5th name had not been erased because it was unimportant. It had been erased because it was dangerous. And now we had found it, which meant that, somewhere in New York, someone who had spent 3 decades believing the secret was safe had just learned that Nero Wolfe had opened the door. Chapter 5. The surgeon's second ledger, Inspector Kramer, telephoned at 7:12 the next morning. I was in the kitchen drinking coffee while Fritz supervised breakfast with the expression of a man who believed that undercooked eggs represented a moral failure. The telephone rang. I answered. Goodwin, Kramer's voice said. Get Wolfe. Good morning to you too. Get him. What's happened? One of Bell's colleagues is in trouble. What kind? The kind that makes me wish I'd stayed in bed. I carried the receiver toward the office. Wolfe was already there. Of course. He sat behind his desk in a maroon dressing gown, reading a newspaper while a tray of coffee waited beside him. I held out the receiver. Inspector Kramer. He took it. Yes, I heard Kramer's voice rise through the receiver. Thomas Avery is missing. Wolfe's expression did not change. Missing since when? Last night. Where? His house. Any signs of violence? No. Then why are you concerned? Because he left something behind. What? An empty envelope. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. The 5th? Yes. There was a pause. How do you know? Because I have it. I looked at Wolfe. He looked at me. Kramer continued. Found it in Avery's study. The envelope was open. Whatever was inside is gone. Anything else? His wife says Avery received a phone call yesterday afternoon. From whom? She doesn't know. Did he say anything afterward? One thing. What? He said, they found it. Wolfe was silent. Then, send Mr. Goodwin. Kramer grunted. I was hoping you'd say that. He hung up. Wolfe handed me the receiver. Breakfast first. I stared at him. Thomas Avery is missing. Yes. The 5th envelope has been opened. Yes, and you want breakfast. I always want breakfast. Thomas Avery's house stood on a quiet street in Upper Manhattan, where the trees were old enough to have opinions about the architecture. A police car waited outside. Kramer stood on the front steps. He looked at me. You look cheerful. I've been fed. That explains it. Inside the house was orderly. Too orderly. Avery had apparently lived alone after his wife's death and had maintained his rooms with the meticulous habits of a man who believed dust represented intellectual weakness. His study was at the rear. Books lined 3 walls, medical journals filled shelves. A mahogany desk occupied the center. Kramer pointed. Nothing forced. Drawer open. Safe locked. Window closed. Body nah. Then what makes you think he was taken? Kramer looked at me. Because his coat is gone. That's weak. His car too. Stronger. He left his wallet. Stronger. His passport. Better. And his watch. Very good. Kramer looked annoyed. You don't have to grade me. I was grading the evidence. The 5th envelope lay inside an evidence bag. Its contents were gone. The paper showed the same red circle, the same number. 5. I examined the flap. No tearing, opened carefully. By Avery, maybe. Fingerprints? Nothing. Where was it? Inside that drawer, he pointed. The drawer contained ordinary correspondence, receipts, medical notes, a fountain pen, nothing else. Could someone have known about the envelope? Bell did. Lang, possibly. Who else? Kramer looked toward the bookshelves. That's what we're trying to determine. I began with the books. Not because I particularly enjoyed medical texts, but because Wolfe had taught me that people arrange books according to what they want to remember. Avery's shelves were unusually precise. Anatomy, surgery, neurology, pathology, cardiology, everything had a place, except one shelf. The medical books there were not arranged by subject, they were arranged by date. I pulled one, another. The dates progressed. Then I noticed gaps. No 1942. I looked at the shelf again. Inspector. Kramer came over. What? The books. Books? They're arranged by date. So? Not publication date. What date? I checked the inside covers. Hospital admission dates. Every book contained a handwritten notation. Small, nearly invisible. I copied them. Then the pattern changed. The dates corresponded to patients admitted to Halstead Clinic. Not ordinary admissions, emergency admissions, cases in which Bell had been involved. I called Wolfe from the hallway. He answered immediately. Yes, I found something. I expected that. Avery's medical books are arranged by admission dates. How many? Mostly. Bring copies. No. You want me back? Immediately. By the time I reached the brownstone, Wolfe had finished breakfast and moved to his office. The documents covered his desk. I laid out the dates. He studied them. Interesting. That word again. Do not interrupt. The sequence stretched over decades. Each date corresponded to a Halstead emergency admission. Each patient had been recorded under a different name. Several were dead. Several had disappeared. 3 had been transferred. 1 had been declared dead before surgery. I pointed to the last entry. That's the patient. Which patient? The unidentified one. Wolfe examined the date. No, I stared. What? This is not the beginning. He pointed backward. Look at the preceding admission. I did. The patient had arrived 3 days before the unidentified man. Same emergency entrance. Same physician. Same transfer designation. Different name. Another protected patient. Yes. And this one? Also. I looked at the next. Another, then another. A sequence emerged. Bell had been tracking patients who entered Halstead under unusual circumstances. A patient arrived. A procedure occurred. The patient disappeared from the public record. Bell recorded the date. Years passed. Another patient. Same pattern. Again. The dates were not merely medical history. They were a search. Bell wasn't looking for one patient. Wolfe nodded. He was following a trail. How long? 20 years. Why? Because the patient kept moving. I looked at him. Peter Lang. Possibly. But Lang wasn't a patient. No. He was one of the physicians. Correct. So what was Bell searching for? Wolfe pointed to the names. Poutons. We spent the next 3 hours reconstructing the sequence. It was tedious work. It was also the kind Wolfe enjoyed most. The medical books supplied dates. The hospital records supplied names. The transfer records supplied aliases. Private notes supplied fragments. Gradually, the pattern became unmistakable. The unidentified patient had been admitted under no name. 3 days later, another patient entered under the name Daniel Price. Years later, someone using the same identity appeared in a different city, then disappeared. A decade later, another emergency admission involved a man whose medical history contained an unusual surgical scar. The procedure matched Bell's technique. The patient had given a false name, and 20 years after the original operation, the same pattern appeared again. Wolfe looked at the dates. He survived. Who? The patient, you know. I suspect. That's different, not now. He tapped the final date. Bell was looking for him. Why? Because the patient had something Bell needed. The truth. No. What then? Wolfe looked at me. Proof. At 4 in the afternoon, Kramer returned. He had obtained additional records from the hospital. You're right, he said. About. Avery was investigating old admissions. Why? He made notes. Where? In his office. Kramer handed me a sheet. Avery had written several names. Most were crossed out. One remained. Daniel Price. Beside it, same scar, same procedure, same age progression. Below that, find current address. And beneath everything, Bell knows more than he admits. I looked at Wolfe. He remained calm. That changes things, Kramer said. Yes. You think Avery found the patient? No. Then why was he searching? Because he believed Bell had found him. Kramer rubbed his forehead. Why would Bell hide the patient for 30 years? Wolfe answered. He may not have been hiding the patient. What were protecting him? From whom? Wolfe looked toward the empty chair in the photograph. From the people who needed him dead. That evening I returned to Bell's townhouse. The police had already searched it. But Wolfe had given me a list. Not a search list, a reading list. Medical books. The shelves had been dusted. Most had been returned to their original places. Except one. Bell's private study contained 3 shelves of surgical texts. They were arranged alphabetically, or appeared to be. I pulled the first volume. Inside was a handwritten date. I checked the next, another. The dates formed a sequence. Bell had done exactly what Avery had done, except his sequence was longer, much longer, 30 years. Every few months, another date, another admission, another patient, another false identity, another disappearance. And beside several entries was the same small red circle, the mark from the envelopes. I photographed the pages. Then I noticed one final book. It was not a medical text. It was a history of hospital administration. Its pages had been cut open and hollowed. Inside rested a small black notebook, Bell's second ledger. I opened it. The first page contained one sentence. If I cannot find him, I will find the people who moved him. The next pages contained names, not patients, doctors, administrators, lawyers, bankers, drivers, nurses, and beside each name, a date, a payment, a transfer, a hospital, the same network, the same trail, the same patient. I turned to the final page. Only one line had been written. The fifth name was never the fifth person. It was the fifth witness. Then a third time, I called Wolfe. Found another ledger. His voice remained calm. Where? Bell's study. What does it contain? The people who moved the patient. Good. And one sentence. Read it. I did. There was silence. Then Wolfe said, now we know what the fifth name means.
Peter Lang.
Yes, the fifth witness. Exactly. Then why was he erased? Because the other four were participants. And Lang? He became a witness. Thought of the empty chair. The chair wasn't for Lang. No, it was for the witness, correct. I sat down at Bell's desk. The meaning of the photograph shifted again. Four for doctor standing, one chair, a place reserved for someone who had refused to stand with them. Peter Lang had not been erased because he was unimportant. He had been erased because he had become inconvenient. I returned to the brownstone just before midnight. Wolfe was in the office. I placed Bell's second ledger beside the first. For several minutes he read without speaking. Then he closed it. Bell spent years searching for the patient. Yes, not to harm him, to protect him, or to find proof that he survived. I nodded. The sequence begins with the original operation. Yes. Then follows every suspected transfer. Yes. And ends shortly before Bell disappeared. Exactly. Wolfe leaned back. He finally found the trail. Daniel Price. Yes. And Avery found it too, which explains his disappearance. And the fifth envelope. Someone wanted the evidence. Yes. But Bell had hidden a second ledger. Yes. Wolfe looked at the two books. That is why the fur ledger was left behind. The fifth envelope, an invitation. To us. Not to us. He looked toward me. To the person capable of understanding it. Who? Nero Wolfe. I smiled. You do have a healthy opinion of yourself. I have an accurate one. He reached for the telephone. Call Kramer. Again. Tell him we know where to look. For Daniel Price? No. For the person who has been following and picked up the receiver. Who is that? Wolfe's face became grave. The man who spent 20 years making sure the patient remained invisible. I stopped. You mean someone has been following the same trail Bell followed? Yes. Then Bell wasn't searching alone. No. He was being watched. Precisely. And the disappearance? Wolfe looked toward the dark window. Was not the beginning of the danger. He tapped Bell's second ledger. It was the moment the hunter realized he was being hunted. I dialed Kramer. Behind me the orchids stood silent beneath their lamps. The city outside continued its usual business. Cars moved, windows glowed. People walked home. Somewhere among them, perhaps, lived a man who had been declared dead before he was old enough to understand what death meant. And somewhere else, someone who had spent 3 decades protecting a secret had just discovered that Dr. Arthur Bell had left behind not one ledger, but 2. The first told us that money had changed hands. The second told us why, and between them was a trail leading directly to the patient who had never been listed. Chapter 6. The patient behind the name. The trouble with a false name is that it has to live somewhere. A real name may sit quietly in a birth certificate, a tax record, a marriage license, and the memory of relatives who have known it since childhood. A false name has no such luxury. It must be fed regularly. It needs a room, an occupation, a bank account, a signature, a telephone number. It needs somebody to answer when the mail arrives. That was why Nero Wolfe sent me after Daniel Price. Not because Wolfe believed Daniel Price was the man's real name. He had already settled that. He wanted to know whether the name had been used carefully enough to survive 20 years. I found the answer in an insurance file. But I am getting ahead of myself. Wolfe had spent the first hour of the morning surrounded by papers. The two ledgers rested beside one another on his desk. The first contained payments made on the night of the unidentified operation. The second contained Bell's private investigation into the patient's later movements. Between them lay the photograph of 5 positions, 4 physicians, and 1 empty chair. Wolfe studied it while I finished coffee. You will begin with Daniel Price. Address, employment, all of it. Insurance, especially. Why insurance? Because people lie to governments. Naturally. They employers frequently. They lie to friends, almost professionally. But they become cautious with insurance companies. I looked at him. Why? Because money depends upon accuracy. That was Wolfe's explanation. It was also sufficient. He handed me a sheet of paper. The first address, a boarding house in Brooklyn, 29 years earlier. The second, a rented room near Newark, 27 years earlier. The third, an apartment in Queens, 24 years earlier. Then 2 addresses in Manhattan. Finally, 1 residence occupied continuously for 18 years. He's still there? Probably. Occupation unknown. Married? Unknown. Children? Unknown. Age? Unknown. You're sending me after a man who may not exist. I am sending you after a man who has existed for 20 years. That is considerably more reassuring. Do not become sentimental. I'll try. He reached for his coffee. Mr. Goodwin. Yes, do not tell him about Bell. I stopped. Why? Because if he is the patient, he may know where Bell is. And if he doesn't, then he may know who does. The first address belonged to a building that had been converted into offices. The second was a warehouse. The third had been demolished. The fourth remained. An old apartment building on the Upper West Side. The superintendent remembered Daniel Price. Quiet fellow, he said. How long ago? Maybe 20. Did he live alone as far as I know? Occupation, something with accounts. Where did he work? Which company? The superintendent thought. Price and Bell, my attention sharpened. Bell, no. Bell wasn't part of the company. He scratched his head. Something like Price, Bell and Associates. Are you sure? No. What do you remember? He paid on time. That is your chief memory? With tenants? That's usually enough. Did he have visitors? 1 man. Who? Older? Name? Description: grey hair. Expensive coat. How often? Every few months. When did he stop? The superintendent looked at me. About a year ago. Before Bell disappeared? Yes. Anything unusual? He once asked me if anyone had been asking questions about him. Did anyone? Not then. What about recently? The superintendent shrugged. 2 men came around last month. What did they want? Daniel. Did they find him? No. Why? He moved. When? Almost 18 years ago. I stared at him. That apartment was occupied by him for only a few years? Yes. The trail had shifted again. False names were beginning to resemble footprints. By noon, I had located another record. A small insurance company in Lower Manhattan had merged twice, changed its name once, and retained old files because somebody in management believed destroying paperwork was bad business. I liked that person. The file contained a life insurance policy issued to Daniel Price 18 years earlier. Occupation: independent financial consultant. Beneficiary: Margaret Price. I checked. No marriage record existed under that name. Interesting. The policy had been renewed repeatedly. Medical examinations had been required. Each examination contained the same curious detail: a scar, lower abdomen. The size and location matched Bell's surgical notes. The insurer had also recorded the man's age. 41 when the policy began. 59 now. That fit the patient. The medical history contained 1 entry: emergency abdominal procedure, approximately 20 years prior. No hospital name, no surgeon, no complications. I smiled. Bell's work had followed him for 2 decades, even under a false identity. The address attached to the insurance policy was in Connecticut. The drive took nearly 2 hours. The house stood at the end of a quiet road lined with trees. It was modest, well maintained. No gates, no security cameras, No obvious reason for me to suspect the occupant of having lived through one of the most carefully concealed medical deceptions in Manhattan history. I rang the bell. A man opened the door. He was approximately 60. Grey hair, thin face, calm eyes. His clothes were simple but expensive. He looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he said, "You work for Nero Wolfe." It was not a question. I smiled. "That's inconvenient. Very. May I come in?" He opened the door. Yes, the room was warm and orderly. Bookshelves, a piano, a desk, several framed photographs. One showed a woman, another showed a boy, another showed the same man, perhaps 15 years younger. He watched me examining the room. "You're looking for proof." "I generally am. You've found it." "Daniel Price?" He sighed. "No," I waited. "My name is Peter Lang." The name seemed to alter the temperature. For a moment I forgot every prepared question. The fifth name, the erased physician, the empty chair. The man declared dead 31 years earlier. He had been sitting across from me all along. I pulled out a chair. "You're Peter Lang?" "Yes." "You're alive?" "Apparent new." "Yes." "Who else?" "Fewer people than you might imagine." I sat. "Then let's start at the beginning." Peter Lang looked toward the window. "I was a surgeon." "I know." "I worked at Halstead." "I know." 31 years ago I discovered something. "What?" "That a patient had been brought into the hospital under circumstances that made no sense." "The unidentified patient?" "Yes." "No." "But you knew someone was hiding him?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I was asked to sign a false record." "By whom?" "Arthur Bell." I stared at him. "Bell asked you to sign a false record?" "Not initially." "What happened?" "An injured man was brought in late at night. His name? Unknown. Condition? Severe. Bell operated." "Yes." "And saved him. Then what?" Peter folded his hands. "The man who entered the operating room was not the man who left it." I felt a chill. "Explain." "There were 2 men." "Two?" "Yes." "At the hospital?" "One was the patient." "Who was the other?" "Someone who wanted the patient to disappear." I leaned forward. "That sounds like a deliberate exchange." It was. Peter Lang told the story slowly. 31 years earlier, just before midnight, a badly injured man had been brought into Halstead Clinic. No identification, no wallet, no witnesses willing to explain how he had been injured. Bell took the case. Lang assisted. The operation lasted nearly 2 hours. The patient survived. But before the transfer could be completed, another man arrived. He looked remarkably similar in age and build. He carried identification belonging to Daniel Price. He was not the patient. He was the person who had arranged the patient's disappearance. Why would he do that? Because the patient had seen something. What? Peter's expression hardened. An ownership transfer. The theater? Yes. I sat back. The Harcourt Theater, the property fraud, the 5 physicians, the hidden contract. Everything suddenly touched. Peter continued. The patient had been employed by a company involved in the theater's acquisition. What did he know? That the sale had been falsified. Names: 3 men. Who? Peter hesitated. Bell. I stared. Bell was involved? At first. What did he do? He participated. Then why save the patient? Because he changed his mind. When? During the operation. Why? Because the patient told him. What would happen if he survived? What? His death would be arranged. Peter's voice became quieter. The man on the operating table was supposed to die officially, and the other man would take his identity. I stared. So Daniel Price was not the patient's alias? No. Daniel Price was the identity used to replace him. Exactly. The false identity had not been created for the patient. It had been exchanged. A man who should have disappeared was given a new life. Another man's identity was assigned to the record, and the hospital's paperwork was altered to make the exchange appear legitimate. I remembered Wolfe's words. The 5th name was never the 5th person. It was the 5th witness. Peter Lang had witnessed the exchange. Why did you disappear? Because I refused to sign. What happened? They told me I had misunderstood. You hadn't? No. Then I wrote the truth. Bell? He destroyed it. Why? He was frightened. Of whom? The men who controlled the transfer. Who were they? Peter looked toward one of the framed photographs. The answer came softly. The people who owned the money. That was not enough. Names. He hesitated. Then, Thomas Avery. I stared. The missing physician. Thomas Avery was involved? Yes. Samuel Reed? Yes. Martin Hale? Peter's silence answered before he did. Yes, and Bell. Bell was the fourth. I felt the shape of the old photograph. 4 men, chair. Peter had not been standing with them. He had been the witness. The empty chair had been his. Then, why was your name preserved in the charity program 20 years later? Because someone wanted me to know they remembered. Who? Bell. Bell knew where you were. Yes. How? We stayed in contact. Secretly, always. Exposed the peoples. Exposure would have killed me. How? People had already tried once. I looked at the scar beneath his shirt collar. He noticed. That's the operation. Yes. Who tried to kill you? I don't know. Bell? No. Then who? The people who wanted the patient dead. But the patient survived. Peter nodded. Because Bell chose to save him. I telephoned Wolfe from the car. He answered. I found him. Who? Peter Lang. Silence then. Where? I gave him the address. Is he alive? Very. Good. He says the patient survived because Bell exchanged identities. Wolfe did not respond immediately. Explain. There were 2 men, the patient, and a second man carrying the Daniel Price identity. Go on. The second man's identity was transferred to the patient. Then Daniel Price became the patient's legal identity. And Peter Lang witnessed it. Yes. Who else? Bell. Hale Reed Avery. Wolfe was silent. The 4 men from the photograph. Yes. And Lang. The 5th. The witness. Exactly. Wolfe's voice became quieter. Mr. Goodwin. Yes. Bring him? Peter. Yes, he'll come. How do you know? Because he knows the time has come. Peter arrived at the brownstone 2 hours later. He entered quietly. He looked around the office, the orchids, the books, the great desk, the red leather chairs. Then he looked at Wolfe. I knew you'd find me. Wolfe nodded. You knew Bell would send someone. I hoped. Why? Because Arthur had spent 30 years trying to finish what he began. What was that? To put the identities back where they belonged. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Not expose the patient, no. Restore the truth, yes. For the first time, I understood why Bell had given Eleanor the surgical case, the photograph, the key, the phrase, the 5th name. He had not been asking us to solve a disappearance. He had been asking us to reconstruct an exchange. 2 men had entered the night. 2 identities had changed hands. 1 patient had survived. 1 false death had been created, and 5 physicians had carried the secret. 4 had helped hide it. 1 had refused to forget. Peter placed a small envelope on Wolfe's desk. I kept this. Wolfe did not touch it. What is it? The original identity record. The patient's real name? Yes. I looked at Wolfe. He nodded toward me. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single document, a hospital identification form. The name was written clearly. The man who had entered Halstead under no name had been Jonathan Mercer. I read it twice. Peter said quietly, Daniel Price never existed. I looked up. The identity was created that night. Yes. And the man who originally owned it? Dead. Then the patient became Daniel Price. Yes. And you became the 5th witness? Yes. I thought of insurance file, the house, the wife, the boy, the quiet businessman who had lived for nearly 2 decades under a name that belonged to someone else. He had not stolen an identity. It had been given to him because the truth would have killed him. Wolfe examined the document. Then he looked at Peter. Where is Jonathan Mercer now? Peter smiled faintly. You already know, I stared. Daniel Price. Peter nodded. He has lived under that name for 20 years. The room became silent. Wolfe leaned back. The surgeon's secret, he said, was never the operation. Peter looked at him. No, it was the exchange, yes. And Bell disappeared because he had finally decided to reverse it. Peter's expression tightened. Yes. Wolfe placed the document beside the 2 ledgers. The 5th name has finally spoken. Outside, the city lights shone against the dark windows. Somewhere beyond them lived a man who had been dead on paper for 31 years. Somewhere else stood the remains of a theater whose ownership had been stolen through deception. And on Wolfe's desk lay the evidence connecting them. The case was no longer about finding a missing surgeon. It was about restoring 2 names to the lives they had been forced to exchange. Wolfe looked at me. Mr. Goodwin. Yes? Tomorrow we find Jonathan Mercer, Daniel Price. His real name, Jonathan Mercer. And then? Wolfe's eyes settled upon the 5-place photograph. Then we shall ask why 4 physicians believed they could own the truth. I looked at the empty chair. For 30 years it had waited for the fifth man. Now Peter Lang had returned, and somewhere in the city, the man who had been given another man's identity was waiting too. The operation had lasted less than 2 hours. The consequences had lasted 31 years, and Nero Wolfe had finally found the patient behind the name. Chapter 7. Wolfe reads the fifth name. By 10 o'clock that morning, the brownstone had acquired the atmosphere of a courtroom without the inconvenience of a judge. Nero Wolfe disliked courts. He considered them inefficient places where too many people spoke before the facts had finished arranging themselves. His office was better. The witnesses sat where Wolfe wanted them. The documents lay where he wanted them, and nobody was permitted to leave until he had finished. Inspector Kramer occupied the largest available chair after Wolfe's own. His hat rested on one knee, his broad face carrying the expression of a man who had been promised an explanation and intended to collect every word of it. Martin Hale sat near the window. Samuel Reed sat beside him. Thomas Avery occupied the chair nearest the fireplace, guarded by Sergeant Stebbins. Avery had been found that morning at a small private clinic outside the city. He had not been injured, he had been frightened, which in the circumstances was more useful information. Peter Lang sat opposite him. Eleanor Price occupied the red leather chair near the bookcase, and beside her sat Jonathan Mercer, or Daniel Price, depending upon which 31 years of paperwork one consulted. He looked ordinary. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about him. He was a quiet man in his late 50s, with grey at his temples and the cautious manner of someone who had spent most of his adult life avoiding attention. He had lived nearly 2 decades as Daniel Price, yet his real name was Jonathan Mercer. The fifth name had finally acquired a face. I stood near Wolfe's desk with my notebook. The 2 ledgers were open before him. The photograph of the 5 positions lay between them. The brass key rested beside the photograph. On the wall behind Wolfe, sunlight fell across a vase of orchids that Fritz had arranged that morning. The flowers were pale and immaculate, an absurdly civilized decoration for a room containing 5 men whose lives had been twisted around a secret for more than 3 decades. Wolfe looked at them all. Then he said, "Before we begin, I shall establish one fact. Nobody moved. Dr. Arthur Bell is dead." Eleanor lowered her eyes. Jonathan Mercer closed his hands. Martin Hale stared at the carpet. Kramer looked toward Wolfe. "You've confirmed that?" "No." The inspector's face tightened. "Then why say it? Because he is not here. That's not evidence." "No." Wolfe folded his hands. "But it is the only reason the rest of you are here." Silence. Then he turned toward Kramer. "Inspector, you have not yet found Bell's body." "No." "You have found evidence that he was taken." "Yes." "Evidence that he was threatened." "Yes." "Evidence that he was searching for Jonathan Mercer." "Yes." "And evidence that someone searched Eleanor Price's apartment." "Yes." Wolfe nodded. "Then we may safely assume that Bell's disappearance was not voluntary." Kramer grunted. "I've been assuming that for days." "Then you have finally reached a useful assumption." I saw Kramer prepare a response and wisely abandon it. Wolfe turned to Jonathan. "You are Peter Lang's patient." Jonathan corrected him quietly. "I am Jonathan Mercer. Legally, no. Biologically, yes." "Then the distinction is important." Jonathan looked at the floor. "I have lived as Daniel Price for almost 20 years. "Yes." "Before that, different places? Different names?" "Mostly." Wolfe nodded. "That was necessary." Jonathan looked toward Peter Lang. "Yes." Peter met his eyes. "For 31 years. Wolfe lifted the photograph. "This picture has confused everyone because everyone assumed it showed 5 physicians." He placed one finger beneath Arthur Bell's position. "Bell." Then Martin Hale, Dr. Hale, Samuel Reed, Dr. Reed, Thomas Avery, Dr. Avery. Then the empty chair, and this, he tapped the chair. "The 5th position," Peter Lang spoke. "Mine." Wolfe nodded. "Yes." Kramer leaned forward. "But you weren't a physician in the picture." "No, you were." Peter looked at him. "I was. Then why aren't you standing there?" "Because I had already left." Wolfe answered for him. "Because Peter Lang had ceased to be one of them." Kramer frowned. "One of whom?" "The conspirators." Nobody spoke. Wolfe continued. 31 years ago, 5 physicians became involved in a medical deception. Martin Hale shifted. Wolfe noticed. Dr. Hale remembers it differently. Yes, Dr. Reed remembers it differently. Reed said nothing. Dr. Avery remembers it differently. Avery's face had gone pale. And Peter Lang remembers it differently from all of them. Peter gave a tired smile. That is because I refuse to forget. Wolfe inclined his head. Exactly. He opened the first ledger. The night of the operation began with the arrival of a badly injured man. Jonathan Mercer sat very still. No identification. Severe abdominal injuries. Bell performed emergency surgery. Jonathan nodded. Successfully. Yes. The official register states that the patient died before surgery. Kramer looked at the page. False. Entirely false. Wolfe opened Bell's private notes. Bell knew the patient had survived. Yes. He also knew the patient was in danger. Jonathan's voice was quiet. Very great danger. Wolfe looked toward him. You had witnessed something. Jonathan nodded. The theatre. The Harcourt Theatre? Yes. You worked for the company that handled the transfer? Accounting. You discovered the property fraud. I found payments. Payments to whom? Jonathan looked at the 4 physicians. People who were supposed to make the transfer appear legitimate. Wolfe's eyes moved to the first ledger. The payments. Kramer picked it up. So the medical operation was connected to the theatre, indirectly at first. Explain. Wolfe turned toward Jonathan. You were not merely a witness to the property fraud. No, you were the legal heir. Jonathan said nothing. Eleanor looked at him. Kramer frowned. Whose heir? Jonathan swallowed. Name? Edmund Mercer. I wrote it down. Wolfe continued. Edmund Mercer held the controlling interest in the property company that legally owned the Harcourt Theatre. Kramer looked at the recovered ownership papers. But someone else claimed it. Yes, through fraudulent transfer. Who? Wolfe looked at the 4 physicians. That is where the medical conspiracy began. Martin Hale finally spoke. We did not know he was the heir. Wolfe looked at him. You knew enough. I knew there was a dispute. You knew Mercer had a claim. I knew there were competing documents. You signed the medical statement. I was told the patient was dying. He was not. I did not know. Wolfe's expression remained cold. You knew. Hale lowered his eyes. Not at first. When? After the operation. And then? I was told the patient had to disappear. By whom? Hale said nothing. Wolfe answered. By the men who had already claimed the property. Kramer looked from Hale to Reed. Who were they? Wolfe raised a hand. That question belongs to the final documents. He opened the second ledger. First, we must understand the exchange. I had heard the story once from Peter. Now Wolfe reconstructed it with the precision of a man rebuilding a machine from its broken parts. Jonathan Mercer had been brought into Halstead Clinic shortly before midnight. He had been attacked because he had discovered evidence that his father's property had been transferred through fraud. The men behind the scheme knew that Jonathan was the legal heir. They needed him silent. They also needed the official records to show that he was dead. But Bell operated, and Bell saved him. The problem was what came afterward. A second man arrived at the clinic. He carried identification belonging to Daniel Price. Daniel Price had died under circumstances unrelated to Jonathan. His identity had been obtained and prepared for use. Jonathan became Daniel Price. Daniel Price's death was entered into another record, and the hospital register was altered so that Jonathan appeared to have died before surgery. A death for one man, a life for another, an identity exchange. Kramer stared at Wolfe. That's insane. No, Wolfe corrected him. It was carefully planned. Who arranged it? That is what the 5th name tells us. He looked at Peter. You. Peter shook his head. I discovered it. Exactly. The room remained quiet. Wolfe continued. Every witness remembered a different version because each saw a different part of the same night. He turned toward Martin Hale. You saw the operation. Hale nodded. You believe the patient was merely another unidentified casualty. Then Samuel Reed. You saw the paperwork. Reed swallowed. You believe the transfer was legitimate. Thomas Avery. You handled the financial arrangements. Avery's eyes closed. You knew money had changed hands. Then, Peter Lang. You saw the patient alive after the operation. Peter nodded. And you discovered the second identity. Yes. Therefore you were the only one who could prove that the official record was false. Peter said nothing. Wolfe's voice became quieter. That made you the fifth witness. The phrase hung in the room. The fifth name, the fifth position, the fifth envelope, the fifth witness. Everything connected. Kramer looked at the photograph. Then why was the chair empty? Because Peter had already refused. Refused what? To participate, Peter answered. They wanted me to sign the final statement. You refused. Yes. What did you do? I wrote the truth. Wolfe nodded. That statement became dangerous. Very. So they erased your name. From the hospital history. From professional records. Yes. Not because you were unimportant. Peter's voice was bitter. Because I was the one person who could contradict them. Eleanor looked toward Jonathan. Why did you never tell anyone? Jonathan answered quietly. Because Bell saved my life. But he helped hide you. He had to. Why? Jonathan looked at Wolfe. Wolfe answered. Because the people who wanted you dead had not disappeared. Jonathan nodded. For years they looked for me. Under your real name. Yes. Then you became Daniel Price. Yes. Why that name? It was the identity they had prepared. The false death. Yes. Wolfe looked toward the recovered insurance records. Eventually the false identity became a real life. Jonathan gave a faint smile. I married under Daniel Price, yes. She died 3 years ago. I am sorry, Jonathan nodded. I had a son. Does he know? No. Wolfe was silent for a moment. Then he said, that is the price of survival. Kramer turned toward Thomas Avery. And you? Avery remained motionless. What did you know? Avery finally looked up. Everything. Kramer stood. You knew Mercer was alive? Eventually. You knew he was the heir? Yes. You knew Bell protected him? Yes. And you still tried to recover the fifth envelope. Avery's face hardened. Because the documents could destroy everything. Everything we built. Everything we built. Wolfe corrected him. Everything you stole. Avery said nothing. Kramer took a step toward him. Why did you disappear? I panicked. Who contacted you? No one. Then why run? Avery looked at Wolfe. Because I knew Bell had found the last document. What document? The original inheritance agreement. Kramer stared. Where? Wolfe answered. Still hidden. That produced the first real silence of the gathering. Even I looked at Wolfe. You know where it is? Yes, Kramer said. Where? Wolfe looked at the brass key. Mr. Goodwin, I understood. The old cabinet. The key. Yes. The fifth envelope. Not the fifth envelope. He pointed toward the key. The cabinet beneath the old records room contained 5 envelopes, 4 correspondence files, 1 ledger. But the ledger wasn't the final evidence. No. What is? The compartment beneath the cabinet. I stared. You found another compartment? Not I, then. Who? Bell. The realization struck me. The key opened the cabinet. Yes. But there was another lock, hidden beneath the ledger. I remembered the small indentation in the wood. A detail I had ignored. Wolfe continued. Bell discovered the original inheritance agreement after years of searching. Where? In the cabinet's lower compartment. And he removed it. Yes. Where is it now? Wolfe looked at Eleanor. She reached into her handbag. My eyebrows rose. She placed a narrow envelope on the desk. I found this inside the surgical case. I stared at her. You didn't mention that. I didn't know what it was. Wolfe opened it. Inside lay an original legal document. The ink had faded. The signatures remained clear. Edmund Mercer's name. His son's inheritance rights. The original ownership agreement for the Harcourt property. And beneath it, the clause that destroyed the entire fraudulent transfer. Jonathan Mercer was the legal heir. The property could never have been transferred without his consent. He had never given it. The theft had been invalid from the beginning. Kramer read the page, then looked at Wolfe. So that's what they wanted. Yes. The fifth name, no. The patient, no. The document. Exactly. Wolfe placed the agreement beside the photograph. The fifth name led us to the fifth witness. The witness led us to the patient. The patient led us to the inheritance. And the inheritance led us to the crime. Kramer exhaled slowly. I hate it when you do that. I know. Wolfe then turned to the central question. Why did Bell disappear? Nobody answered. So he did. Because one of the original conspirators discovered that Bell had found the inheritance agreement. Avery looked away. You. Avery remained silent. You forced Bell to reveal where the evidence was hidden. No. Wolfe's voice hardened. You entered his office. Avery's eyes lifted. You threatened him, I asked him. You threatened him. Avery said nothing. You searched his records. Yes. You discovered the second ledger. No. You discovered enough. Avery looked exhausted. I needed the location, the original document. Yes. And Bell refused. Yes. So you frightened him. I did not intend for him to disappear. Yet he did. Avery looked down. I only wanted the paper. Wolfe nodded. There is the confession. Kramer stood. That's enough for me. He motioned toward Stebbins. The sergeant stepped forward. Avery did not resist. As he passed Jonathan Mercer, he stopped. For several seconds, the two men looked at one another. Jonathan said quietly, You could have told the truth. Avery answered, So could you. Jonathan shook his head. I was trying to stay alive. Avery was led away. The room gradually emptied. Kramer remained behind with the documents. Martin Hale had agreed to cooperate. Samuel Reed had done the same. Peter Lang stayed with Jonathan. Eleanor remained near the door. Wolfe sat behind his desk, apparently exhausted by nothing except perhaps the existence of other people. Kramer gathered the evidence. The fraud is clear. Yes. The identity exchange is clear. Yes. Bell's role. Kramer looked at him. He helped save Mercer. Yes. But he helped create the false record. Yes. He was both participant and protector. Precisely. Will that matter? It will matter to the law. Kramer nodded. And to you. Wolfe looked at the orchids. It matters that he changed his mind. Kramer studied him for a moment. You're almost sentimental. Do not insult me. The inspector smiled. Then he gathered the final papers. At the door he stopped. One question. Wolfe looked up. Why did Bell send the case to you? Wolfe considered the question, then said, Because he knew the truth had become too complicated for ordinary memory. Kramer nodded. Fair enough. He left. The front door closed. The office became quiet. Only Wolfe, Archie, Jonathan, Peter, and Eleanor remained. Jonathan stood near the window. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, he had no reason to hide. Peter looked at him. I suppose it's over. Wolfe shook his head. No. Peter frowned. The case is finished. That is not the same thing. What remains? Wolfe looked toward Jonathan. Your name. Jonathan stared at him. Wolfe pushed the original inheritance document across the desk. That belongs to you. Jonathan touched it. His hand trembled. For 31 years he had lived beneath another man's identity. Tonight at last, the paper had returned his name. I looked at the photograph one final time. 5 positions, 4 men, 1 chair. The chair had never been empty. It had been waiting, and now the 5th man was standing again. Not beside the conspirators, opposite them. Wolfe leaned back. The 5th name, he said quietly, was never hidden because it was the least important. He looked at Peter Lang. It was hidden because it was the one name that could make the other 4 speak. I thought of the photograph, the false death, the exchanged identity, the missing records, the ledgers, the brass key, the surgeon who had closed his door, and the patient who had spent 31 years living behind another man's name. The mystery had begun with 3 words, the 5th name. Now we knew why. It was not merely a name. It was the place where every lie in the case eventually met the truth. Chapter 8. The secret the surgeon kept. There are times when a case appears to be finished. Because the principal villain has been identified, the evidence is on the table, and Inspector Kramer has acquired that particular expression, which means handcuffs are about to become involved. This was not one of those times. At 10 minutes past 9 the next morning, Kramer was back in Wolfe's office. He had brought 2 detectives, 3 folders, and a face that suggested he had spent the night discovering additional reasons to dislike Thomas Avery. Wolfe had brought breakfast. That was the difference between the police and us. Fritz had prepared eggs with smoked salmon, toast, fruit, and coffee. Wolfe sat behind his desk, wearing a dark green dressing gown, his expression serene, while the rest of us carried the appearance of people who had spent the previous 24 hours reconstructing 31 years of fraud. I was standing beside the window. Peter Lang sat in the red leather chair. Jonathan Mercer occupied the chair opposite him. Eleanor Price was near the bookcase. Kramer stood beside Wolfe's desk. On the desk lay the 4 objects with which the case had begun: the brass key, the faded photograph, the first ledger, and the false patient record. Wolfe had arranged them in a straight line. I had learned that when Wolfe arranged objects in a straight line, they were about to become witnesses. Kramer noticed them. "You're going to explain those again?" "No. Why not? I explained them yesterday. Yesterday you explained the 5th name. Today I shall explain the surgeon." Kramer pulled out a chair. "I hope the distinction is worth the trouble." "It is," he sat. I looked at Wolfe. "You found Bell?" "No. That got everyone's attention." Kramer leaned forward. "You said yesterday that Bell was alive." "I said his body had not been found." "That's not the same thing." "No. Do you believe he's alive?" "Yes." Kramer frowned. "Based on what?" Wolfe pointed to the brass key. "That, the key, the photograph, the ledger, and the false patient record." He touched each in turn. "Together they tell us what Bell intended." Kramer shook his head. "Then tell us." Wolfe lifted his coffee. "I shall." Before he began, Wolfe ate 2 bites of egg. That was his way. If the universe had collapsed around the brownstone, he would probably have finished breakfast before investigating the wreckage. I waited. Kramer waited. Jonathan waited. Peter Lang waited. Eleanor looked toward me. I gave her a small shrug. She had not yet learned that interrupting Wolfe during breakfast was a more dangerous occupation than performing surgery without anesthesia. Finally, Wolfe set down his fork. Arthur Bell did not disappear to escape his past. Nobody spoke. He disappeared because his past had finally become dangerous enough to require protection. Kramer said, "Protection from whom?" "Thomas Avery. We know Avery threatened him." "No." Kramer frowned. "You said he threatened him yesterday." "I said he forced him to reveal the location of the evidence." "That's a threat." "Perhaps." "Then what's the difference?" "The difference is that Avery believed he had succeeded." Kramer stared at him. Wolfe continued. He had not. The first object was the photograph. Wolfe lifted it. "The photograph was taken at the medical charity dinner 20 years ago." Kramer nodded. 4 physicians were standing. "Yes." 1 chair was empty. "Yes." The empty chair represented Peter Lang. Peter said nothing, not because he was absent by accident. Wolfe looked at him. Because he had already been removed from the official history. Peter nodded. "Yet the program still listed him." "Yes." "Why?" Peter answered. "Bell." Wolfe nodded. "Bell arranged for the name to remain in selected private records." "Why?" "So that someone searching carefully would know that Peter Lang had not simply vanished." Kramer looked irritated. "Why leave a trail?" "Because Bell knew he might someday need a witness." "A witness to what?" "The original crime." Wolfe put down the photograph. "The theft of the Mercer inheritance." Jonathan's hands tightened. Kramer looked toward him. "Your father's estate?" "Yes." "The Harcourt property?" "Yes." "The transfer was forged?" "Yes." "Using legal records?" "Yes." "And medical records?" Jonathan nodded. "Yes." Kramer looked back at Wolfe. "That's the part I still don't understand." "Then we shall begin there." 31 years earlier, Edmund Mercer owned the controlling interest in the company that held the Harcourt Theatre and several adjoining properties. His son, Jonathan Mercer, was the legal heir. The property was valuable, far more valuable than the public understood. The theatre itself was only one piece. The surrounding lots had been acquired under old development agreements, and the rights attached to them had become extremely valuable as Manhattan changed. Several men wanted control. Thomas Avery was one of them. Samuel Reed was another. Martin Hale became involved through financial connections. Arthur Bell became involved because he was connected to the men through professional and personal relationships. Peter Lang was not part of the scheme. He discovered it. Jonathan Mercer had also discovered it. That was the beginning. The conspirators needed Jonathan removed from the chain of ownership. They could have killed him. But a dead heir creates questions. A missing heir creates rumors. A dead man with a medical record creates paperwork. Paperwork can be manipulated. That was the crucial idea. Jonathan was attacked. He was brought to Halstead Clinic. The conspirators expected him to die. Bell operated. Jonathan survived. At that point, the plan should have collapsed. It did not. It changed. Wolfe opened the false patient record. This is the hospital's official account. He placed it beside the private surgical note. The official account says the patient died before surgery. He moved to Bell's note. The private account says the operation was completed successfully. Kramer nodded. So Bell falsified the record, yes. To protect Mercer. Eventually. Kramer looked toward Jonathan. You were the patient. Jonathan nodded. I was. Why didn't Bell simply report the truth? Jonathan answered. Because the men outside the hospital were waiting for me. Kramer frowned. Who? People Avery had hired. Avery's name entered the room like a draft under a closed door. Wolfe continued. The problem was identity. Jonathan had been expected to die under his own name. But Bell found another possibility. A man named Daniel Price had recently died. His identity existed in records. His bank accounts were dormant. His employment history was ordinary. His name was clean. The conspirators intended to use that identity for another purpose. Bell turned the scheme against them. He took the identity prepared for a criminal purpose and used it to save the intended victim. Jonathan Mercer became Daniel Price. The hospital register recorded Jonathan Mercer as dead. The transfer papers identified the patient as Daniel Price, and the real Daniel Price was buried under his own death. Two identities had crossed. One man had gained a life. Another had disappeared permanently. The official records concealed both. Kramer shook his head. That is extraordinary. Yes, illegal. Complicated. Deliberately, Kramer looked at Jonathan. Did you agree? I agreed because the alternative was death. Wolfe nodded. That distinction matters. Peter Lang had been the physician who discovered the exchange. He saw Jonathan alive. He saw the false papers. He understood that the patient was being transferred under another identity. He objected. He refused to sign the final statement. He wrote a private account. That made him dangerous. His name was removed from hospital histories. His professional connections were severed. His existence was gradually reduced to a handful of private documents. The fifth name became a forbidden name. But Bell did not abandon him. He preserved copies, the envelopes, the photograph, the ledger, the key, the private surgical notes. For years, Bell maintained a secret correspondence with Peter. And for nearly 20 years, Bell searched for Jonathan, not to expose him, to make certain he remained alive. That was why the medical books had been rearranged by dates. The books were not merely a code. They were Bell's private record of the search. Every unusual emergency admission, every patient transferred under a false identity, every man whose medical history suggested the same surgical scar, every person whose age progression matched the patient Bell had saved. Bell had been looking for the man he had once called Daniel Price. He had finally found him, I said. Then why didn't Bell come forward? Wolfe looked at me. Because finding Jonathan was not enough. What was missing? The inheritance document. The original agreement, yes. Kramer leaned forward. Why was that document so important if the fraud was already established? Because suspicion is not ownership. Wolfe tapped the document. This proves that Edmund Mercer's named Jonathan as his lawful heir. Jonathan looked at the page. His expression was unreadable. This document was never entered into the fraudulent transfer records. Why? Because Avery had it removed, Kramer asked. How? Wolfe turned toward him. That is the point of the entire case. He lifted the brass key. Bell knew where the original records had been stored. The cabinet, yes. The fifth envelope, yes. The ledger, yes. And the lower compartment. Correct. Kramer looked irritated. You never told me about the lower compartment. I had not finished examining it. When did you? Last night. Kramer stared. And, Wolfe nodded toward Eleanor. Miss Price brought the final document. Eleanor looked embarrassed. I did not know what it was. No, Wolfe said. You knew only that Bell wanted it protected. She nodded. Yes, that was sufficient. Kramer picked up the inheritance document. He read the first page, then the second. His expression changed. The signature. Edmund Mercer's. Enticted? Yes. The witness? Still living. Where? Westchester. Kramer looked at Wolfe. You knew. I suspected. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have sent 6 officers. And the evidence might have disappeared. Kramer frowned. You thought someone was still searching. I knew someone was. Who? Wolfe looked at him. Thomas Avery. Avery already knew about the document, yes. He tried to recover it, yes. He believed he succeeded, yes. But he didn't. No. Kramer stared at the evidence. Then where did Bell hide it? Wolfe looked at the brass key. Where? Avery would never think to look. The surgical case. Exactly. The surgical case had been given to Eleanor, not because Bell trusted her with the entire secret, because she was the least likely person to be searched by someone looking for a legal document. The photograph was visible. The key was visible. The phrase was visible. The case itself was old and unremarkable. The true document had been concealed inside a false compartment beneath the lining. I had opened the case on the first night. I had seen the obvious objects. I had not noticed the second layer. Bell had expected Wolfe to notice eventually. He had been right. Wolfe held up the false patient record. This was the second part. The medical record established the identity exchange. The inheritance document established the motive. The ledger established the payments. The photograph established the participants. The brass key established the hiding place. 5 pieces, 5 witnesses, 5 names. The entire case had been designed around the number 5. I said, and Bell knew we would connect them, yes. How? He understood the habits of detectives. I smiled. That's a generous view of us. He understood the habits of intelligent detectives. Better. Kramer returned to the question of Bell. You still haven't explained why Bell vanished. Wolfe looked at the inspector. Because he allowed himself to disappear. Kramer leaned forward. What? Bell was not taken from his office. You just said Avery threatened him. I said Avery threatened him. Then he was taken. No. Kramer stared. Wolfe continued. Bell left his office voluntarily. Why? To make Avery believe he had been forced into hiding. But Avery did force him. Yes. Then what's the difference? The difference is that Bell had already arranged his disappearance. I understood. Before Avery came, yes. Kramer looked at me. Explain. I pointed toward the ledger. Bell knew someone was watching him. Wolfe nodded. He knew Avery had discovered the old investigation and the apartment search. Yes. And the missing documents, yes. So Bell created the appearance of being captured. Correct. Kramer looked toward Jonathan. Where is Bell now? Wolfe shook his head. I do not know. You don't know? No. Then how can you say he planned it? Because of the sequence. The sequence. Bell's appointments were cancelled before Avery confronted him. Kramer went. Still. How long before? 3 days. The disappearing act had already begun. Yes. Why? Because Bell knew someone had found the trail to Jonathan. Exactly. And he needed the final evidence recovered. Kramer looked at the 4 objects. He hid the evidence. Yes, he sent the case to Eleanor. Yes, he vanished. Yes, and waited. Precisely. I said, for what? Wolfe looked at me. For us. I laughed. You make it sound as though he had complete confidence. He did. Why? Because he had tested the chain from Bell to Eleanor. She was his assistant. She was also the daughter of a man who had preserved the 5th name in private papers. Eleanor looked surprised. My father? Your father knew enough to preserve the warning. The 5th name must never be removed from the record. Yes, he trusted Bell. Yes, and Bell trusted you. Eleanor looked at Wolfe. I did not understand why. That was the point. Wolfe turned toward me. Bell did not require Eleanor to understand the entire case. He required her to deliver the evidence. Exactly. The brass key. The photograph. The phrase, the false record. The rest followed. Kramer rose. Then Avery orchestrated the original scheme. Yes, and Bell spent 20 years undoing it. Yes, and Peter Lang was erased because he could expose it. Yes, and Jonathan Mercer was kept under a false identity because the conspirators wanted him dead. Yes, and Bell's disappearance was staged so Avery would believe the evidence was gone. Yes, Kramer looked almost satisfied. Then he frowned. One thing. Wolfe waited. Who ordered the original attack on Mercer? Thomas Avery. Proof. Wolfe pointed to the second ledger. Payment to the security company. Kramer read the entry. Avery's account. No, whose? A shell company, controlled by Thomas Avery. That will hold. There is more. Wolfe opened another page. Payment to the physician who altered the medical record. Kramer looked at the name. Samuel Reed. Reed closed his eyes. Kramer turned to him. Is that true? Reed said quietly. Yes. Why? I thought Mercer was dead, Wolfe interrupted. You thought what you were told? Reed looked at him. Yes, until when? Until the morning after the operation, and then I knew. Why didn't you speak? Reed's voice was almost inaudible. Fear, Wolfe nodded. That was the currency of the conspiracy. Martin Hale had remained silent throughout. Now he spoke. Bell wasn't innocent. Wolfe looked at him. No, he altered the records. Yes, he accepted money. Yes, he participated. Initially. Hale looked at Jonathan. But he saved the man. Jonathan nodded. He did. Hale looked toward Peter. And he protected you. Peter answered. He did. Hale's voice broke slightly. Why? Wolfe answered. Because he finally understood what he had helped create. A silence followed. Then Peter said, Bell once told me something. What? He said a surgeon can make one terrible mistake. Wolfe waited. But if he sees the wound afterward, he has a duty to repair it. Wolfe's expression softened by perhaps 1 degree. That sounds like Bell. Kramer gathered the papers. I'll have Avery charged. Reed? His cooperation will be considered. Same. Peter? He's a witness. Jonathan? Wolfe looked at the man. Jonathan is the heir. Kramer nodded. I'll see what can be done about restoring the records. Jonathan gave a small, almost incredulous laugh. After 31 years? Kramer shrugged. Records are stubborn, Wolfe said. So are names. Jonathan looked at the inheritance document. For the first time since I had met him, he smiled without caution. Kramer moved toward the door, then stopped. You still haven't found Bell, no. You expect him to return? Wolfe considered. Yes. Why? He has one task remaining. What to decide whether he wants his own name restored. Kramer looked puzzled. After everything? Wolfe nodded. Bell spent 30 years protecting another man's name. He looked toward the photograph. Perhaps he has earned the right to reclaim his own. Kramer shook his head. You detectives. The inspector smiled. Of course not. He left. The office became quiet. Peter and Jonathan stood together near the window. Eleanor remained beside the desk. I gathered the papers, the photograph, the ledgers, the false patient record, the inheritance document, the brass key. Each had begun as an isolated object. Now they formed a complete story. A surgeon, a patient, a stolen inheritance, a false death, an exchanged identity, a missing physician, a hidden ledger, a forgotten cabinet, a photograph with an empty chair, and a name that refused to stay erased. Jonathan turned toward Wolfe. I don't know how to thank you. You may begin by taking your document. Jonathan picked it up. What will happen to Daniel Price? Wolfe regarded him. He will continue to exist. Jonathan smiled. I suppose that's the strange part. What? I've been Daniel Price so long that Jonathan Mercer feels like somebody I used to know. Wolfe nodded. Names are habits. Peter laughed softly. And habits are difficult to break. Not if they become unnecessary. Jonathan looked at the inheritance document again. Then perhaps it's time. He and Peter left together. Eleanor remained. She looked at me. Do you think Dr. Bell is really alive? I said. Wolfe does. She looked toward him. Does that mean anything? Wolfe answered without looking up. Usually. She smiled. Then she left. The door closed. I turned toward Wolfe. For several minutes he said nothing. The brownstone was quiet. From upstairs came the faint mechanical hum of the orchid room. The city outside had entered its afternoon rhythm. Cars, sirens, footsteps, telephone bells. New York continuing as though 31 years of deception were merely another piece of unfinished business. I picked up the photograph. You know something, yes. Where Bell is? No. You know he planned to disappear? Yes. You know why? Yes. But you don't know where he went, correct? Does that bother you? Wolfe looked at the photograph. No. Why not? Because he will return, you're certain, almost. Why? He pointed to the brass key. What does a key imply? That something remains locked. And that somebody intends to open it. Wolfe nodded. Bell has one final record to recover. What record? The one that proves who ordered the attack. No. I stared. No. Avery orchestrated the property fraud. Yes. He arranged the identity exchange. Yes. He hired the men who attacked Jonathan. Yes. Then who ordered him to do it? I looked at Wolfe. He leaned back. The man behind Avery, I felt a new chill. There was someone above him? Yes, who? That is what Bell was still investigating. So the case isn't completely over. Wolfe's eyes moved toward the orchids. No, but the inheritance is recovered. Yes, the false identity is explained. Yes, the fifth name is understood. Yes, then what remains? The first? Now frowned. Arthur Bell. Wolfe nodded. The man who began the deception, the man who tried to repair it, the man who disappeared, and the man who still knows who gave the order. I looked at the photograph one final time. Bell, Hale, Reed, Avery, the empty chair. The fifth name had been Peter Lang, but now I understood that the photograph had contained another secret. 4 men stood in the light. 1 man had been erased, and one of those 4 had never been the true architect. Bell had spent 20 years protecting Jonathan Mercer. He had spent 31 years protecting Peter Lang, and in the final months of his life, he had begun protecting the evidence that could expose the man who had stood behind the entire scheme. He had not closed his door because he was afraid of the past. He had closed it because the past had finally opened its door for him. I was putting the photograph away when Wolfe spoke. Archie. Yes? Come here. I went to his desk. He was holding the brass key. Do you know why Bell chose this? Because it opened the cabinet. No. He turned it over. On the underside of the key was a tiny engraving. I had never noticed it. Neither had I noticed that the marks formed letters, A-B, and beneath them, H5. I stared. Halstead 5th floor? No. What then? Wolfe's expression became almost amused. Halstead 5th witness. I laughed. You've made a religion out of the number 5. No. He placed the key beside the photograph. The conspirators did. He closed the ledger. Their mistake was believing that 5 people could keep secret. I smiled. How many did it take? 1. 1 honest witness. I looked toward the empty chair. Peter Lang had been that witness. Jonathan Mercer had been the patient. Arthur Bell had been the surgeon. Thomas Avery had been the conspirator who eventually tried to recover the evidence. And Nero Wolfe had been the man who assembled the pieces. The case had begun with a frightened young woman carrying an old surgical case. It ended with an inheritance restored, a false identity explained, a conspiracy exposed, and a physician's secret finally understood. But Bell remained absent. Somewhere in New York, or perhaps far beyond it, he was still moving quietly through the world. A man who had spent years hiding another man's identity. A man who had known that truth sometimes required patience. A man who had chosen silence not because he lacked courage, but because he understood that evidence destroyed too early was no evidence at all. I looked at Wolfe. One thing. Why did Bell wait so long? Wolfe considered the question. Then he said, because he knew the difference between a secret and evidence. I waited. A secret can be whispered. He touched the inheritance document. Evidence must survive. That was Wolfe's final word on the matter. I looked around the office, the books, the polished desk, the orchids beyond the open door. The empty chair where Wolfe would soon return to his reading, as though 31 years of fraud had been merely an interruption between lunch and dinner. I thought of Arthur Bell. I thought of Peter Lang. I thought of Jonathan Mercer living beneath another man's name. And I thought of the surgeon who had closed his door. A surgeon can conceal a wound from the world. He can cover it, sew it, dress it, hide it beneath a clean shirt, and send the patient home. But the scar remains. And sooner or later, if someone knows where to look, the scar tells the truth. Wolfe reached for his newspaper. The case was finished. Or nearly. I picked up my notebook. Outside, Manhattan was loud, impatient, and gloriously alive. Inside, the orchids stood in perfect silence. And somewhere beyond the brownstone, a surgeon who had spent 30 years protecting a wounded truth was still carrying the scar of what he had done. The door to Wolfe's office was open. The door to Bell's had been closed. That, I thought, was the difference. One man had closed his door to hide the past. The other had opened his mind to find it. And Nero Wolfe, as usual, had found the name everyone else had tried to erase.